I was standing in my childhood bedroom in my silk robe waiting for the makeup artist when my mother said the words that would change everything. "Close your eyes, sweetheart. We have a surprise for you." I smiled. I thought it was my grandmother's necklace, the one she promised me on her deathbed. Instead, I felt hands grip my shoulders. My father's fingers wrapped around my wrists like iron, and then the sound of scissors, cold metal against my scalp, hair falling like snow around my feet. My mother's laughter cutting deeper than any blade. "You thought we'd actually celebrate you," she said, her voice dripping with venom. My father leaned close to my ear. "It's your wedding gift, darling." When I finally opened my eyes and looked in the mirror, I saw a stranger staring back, bald broken and utterly alone. My wedding was supposed to start in 2 hours. But what happened in the next 2 years? That's when the real story begins. Because they didn't just shave my head that morning. They made the biggest mistake of their lives. They left me alive. My name is Angela Stewart. I'm 34 years old, a senior financial analyst at a mid-sized investment firm in Boston, and until this morning, I believed my life was finally coming together. I'd spent the last 10 years building a career, saving every penny, and proving to myself that I was worth more than my family ever made me feel. Today was supposed to be the day all of that paid off. Today, I was getting married. I arrived at my parents' house just after dawn, my wedding dress carefully draped across the back seat of my car. The makeup artist wasn't due for another hour, but I wanted time to settle my nerves, maybe share a quiet cup of coffee with my mother before the chaos began. The house looked exactly as it had throughout my childhood, a modest 2-story colonial with fading blue shutters and a garden my mother had long since stopped tending. I told myself the knot in my stomach was just pre-wedding jitters. I told myself the hesitation I felt climbing those front steps was normal. My mother opened the door before I could knock. Her smile was too wide, too bright, like sunshine that burns instead of warms. "Sweetheart, you're here early," she said, pulling me into a hug that felt more like a trap than an embrace. "Come upstairs, we're getting everything ready for you." My younger sister Melissa was already in my old bedroom, standing by the window, with her phone in her hand. She glanced up when I entered and something flickered across her face. Something I couldn't quite name. Excitement, anticipation, before I could ask my mother was guiding me to the chair in front of my old vanity. "Sit, sit," she said, her hands on my shoulders pressing me down into the seat. "Your father and I have been talking and we realised we never gave you a proper bridal gift." My heart lifted despite myself. "Mum, you don't have to—" "Close your eyes, sweetheart," she interrupted, her voice honey-sweet. "We have a surprise." I hesitated. Something in the air felt wrong, like the moment before lightning strikes. But this was my mother, my family, my wedding day. So I closed my eyes and tried to smile. I expected to feel the cool weight of my grandmother's pearl necklace against my throat, the one she'd worn at her own wedding, the one she had promised me years ago before she died. Instead, I felt my father's hands close around my wrists like handcuffs. "Dad, what?" Melissa's grip locked onto my shoulders from behind, pressing me hard into the chair. I tried to stand, tried to pull away, but they held me fast. Then I heard it. The sound that would haunt me for months to come. Scissors, the metallic whisper of blades opening and closing. "No," I gasped. "No, what are you?" The first cut was the worst. Cold steel against my scalp, and then the sickening sensation of my hair being severed at the root. I felt it fall across my lap, long, dark strands that had taken years to grow, now just dead weight in my silk robe. I screamed. I fought. I begged. My mother kept cutting. Melissa kept filming. My father kept holding my wrists so tight, I could feel my bones grinding together. And through it all, my mother was laughing. Not the warm laugh I remembered from childhood, but something cruel and sharp. "Now you look like the curse you are," she said, her breath hot against my ear as she leaned close, still cutting, still destroying. "The fortune teller was right, you know. Your wedding would destroy this family. When they finally let me go, I lunged for the mirror. I looked at my reflection and saw a stranger. But the real strangers were the people holding the scissors. I sat, frozen in that chair, unable to look away from the bald woman in the mirror. My scalp felt raw and cold. Strands of my dark hair covered my lap, my shoulders, the floor around me like evidence of a crime. And in that moment of shock, my mind did what it always does when faced with unbearable pain. It went searching for explanations in the past. The memories came flooding back, not gently, but like a dam breaking. I remembered my 8th birthday. We were in the backyard, and Melissa, only 5 years old, then squealed with delight as our parents wheeled out a shiny red bicycle with white streamers hanging from the handlebars, and a bell that rang when she touched it. My mother beamed at her, my father lifted her onto the seat, and everyone clapped. I waited for my turn, my heart pounding with hope. When my mother finally came to me, she handed me a book, not even a new book. It was a worn paperback copy of Little Women pages, yellowed and spine-cracked, that I'd seen on the shelf in the basement for years. "You like reading?" my mother said, as if that explained everything. "Melissa needs exercise." I was 8 years old, and I already understood that I was different, less worthy, less loved. At 16, I got the letter that changed my life. A full scholarship to MIT. I ran into the kitchen, waving the acceptance packet, tears of joy streaming down my face, already imagining myself on that campus, finally, somewhere I belonged. My mother was making dinner. She looked at the letter, then at me, and her face didn't show pride or excitement. It showed something closer to disgust. "Don't go," she said, turning back to the stove. "You'll embarrass us if you fail." Not if. When, as if my failure was inevitable, as if I was destined to disappoint. I went anyway. I had to. And I didn't fail. I graduated with honours. But she never came to the ceremony. Neither of them did. They said the drive was too long. I worked hard after college, harder than anyone I knew. I lived in a cramped studio apartment with a roommate who snored ate ramen for dinner most nights and saved every dollar I could. By the time I was 25, I had almost $30,000 in the bank and a decent job at a financial firm. That Christmas, I came home with my year-end bonus, $5,000 in cash. I wanted to help. The house needed repairs, and I knew my parents struggled. My mother hugged me when I showed her the money, told me how proud she was, said she'd keep it safe for me until after the holidays, so I wouldn't be tempted to spend it. I trusted her. I was stupid enough to still want her approval. I never saw that money again. When I asked about it in January, she looked at me like I was crazy. "What money?" she said. "You never gave me any money." That same year, I tried to buy my first apartment. I'd saved enough for a down payment, found a perfect little one-bedroom in Brookline, and felt for the first time in my life like I was building something real. Then the mortgage application came back, rejected. The loan officer looked uncomfortable when I called to ask why. "There's a flag on your credit report," he said carefully. "Prior mental health concerns." I went cold. I'd never seen a therapist in my life. I'd never been hospitalized. I'd never even taken anxiety medication. "There must be a mistake," I told him. He suggested I dispute it, maybe hire a lawyer to investigate. But lawyers cost money I didn't have, and I was too embarrassed to push. I told myself it was an error, a glitch in the system. I told myself it didn't matter, but it did matter. Because someone had put that information there. Someone had made sure I couldn't build a life independent of them. And there was something else. Something I'd buried so deep I almost convinced myself it never happened. I was 13, Melissa was 10. She'd run away from home after an argument with our parents just to a friend's house 2 blocks over. But she'd been gone for hours. When my father dragged her back home, my mother was waiting. I watched from the hallway, hidden in the shadows, as my mother grabbed Melissa by her long blonde ponytail and pulled her into the kitchen. I heard my sister screaming. I heard my mother shouting about disrespect and embarrassment. And then I heard the scissors. When Melissa came out of that kitchen, her beautiful hair was hacked short, uneven, ruined. She was sobbing. My mother stood in the doorway with the scissors still in her hand, breathing hard, her face flushed. "That's what happens when you shame this family," she said. I didn't understand it then. I thought it was discipline, harsh, but maybe deserved. I didn't realize it was a pattern, a warning, a ritual. My grandmother was the only one who ever made me feel like I mattered. She told me I was smart, that I was going places, that I shouldn't listen to my mother's poison. When she died during my senior year of college, I couldn't afford to fly home for the funeral. But she told me once years earlier that she was leaving me something in her will. "You'll have a home, sweetheart," she'd whispered during one of my visits. "I'm making sure of it." I never saw that will. My parents said she'd left everything to them. They sold her house 6 months later and never mentioned it again. Sitting there in that bedroom, my head bare and my heart breaking, all those pieces finally came together into a picture I should have seen years ago. The favoritism, the sabotage, the cruelty disguised as concern, the documents that disappeared, the money that vanished, the mental health flag that destroyed my credit, the scissors. They didn't hate me for who I was. They hated me for what I knew, even if I didn't know it yet. But I did know something. I knew how to survive. I knew how to build a life in the shadows, where they couldn't see, it couldn't touch it, couldn't take it away. That's what I've been doing for the past decade, even if I didn't fully understand why I kept it all so secret. After MIT, I took a job as a junior analyst at Sterling & Cross, a mid-sized investment firm in Boston's financial district. The salary wasn't impressive at first, but I was good at what I did. Numbers made sense to me in a way people never had. Markets followed patterns. Risk could be calculated. Success was measurable. Within 3 years, I was promoted to senior analyst. Within 5, I was managing a portfolio worth $8 million. I lived modestly kept, the same small apartment in Alston, took the tea to work, brought lunch from home in plastic containers. My co-workers thought I was frugal. The truth was more complicated. I was building something, a safety net, an escape fund, a future my family couldn't control. By the time I turned 34, I had $180,000 in a savings account my parents didn't know existed. I'd never mentioned the promotions, never told them about the raises. When they asked about my job, I kept my answers vague. "It's fine, just pushing papers," and changed the subject. Some instinct I couldn't name told me to keep my success invisible. Now, sitting in this bedroom with my ruined scalp and my destroyed wedding day, I understood that instinct had been self-preservation. I met David 8 months ago at a finance conference in New York. I'd been sent to represent our firm at a panel on emerging markets, and I was nervous in a way I rarely was at work. Public speaking had never been my strength. But when the moderator asked about risk assessment in volatile economies, something clicked. I forgot about the audience and just talked about the data, the patterns, the strategy. Afterward, a man approached me at the coffee station. He was tall, maybe 40, with greying temples and an easy smile that made him look both sophisticated and approachable. "That was impressive," he said, extending his hand. "David Chen, I'm with North Point Capital." I knew North Point. Everyone in our industry did. They managed portfolios 3 times the size of ours. "Angela Stewart," I replied, shaking his hand and trying not to show how flustered I felt. "I'm surprised someone from North Point bothered with our small panel." "Small doesn't mean insignificant," he said. "Your analysis of the Southeast Asian markets was sharper than anything I've heard in months. Have you considered moving to a larger firm?" We talked for 20 minutes, then an hour. Then we were having dinner at a small Italian place in Midtown, and he was asking about my background, my education, my approach to risk management. He listened like my words mattered, like I mattered. When I mentioned I'd gone to MIT, his eyes lit up with genuine respect. "Scholarship?" he asked. "Full ride," I admitted. feeling a small flush of pride I usually kept buried. That's remarkable. Your parents must be incredibly proud. The question caught me off guard. I felt my smile falter. They're complicated, I said carefully. Something shifted in his expression then. A flicker of something I couldn't quite read. He glanced at his watch and changed the subject smoothly. It's getting late. Can I get your number? I'd love to continue this conversation. I gave it to him. Why wouldn't I? He was charming, successful, and he seemed genuinely interested in me. Not the diminished version my family saw, but the competent professional I'd become. We started dating long distance. He'd drive up to Boston every other weekend, or I'd take the train down to New York. He took me to museums, nice restaurants, Broadway shows. He asked about my work and actually listened to the answers. He never made me feel like I was too much or not enough. For the first time in my life, I felt seen. When he proposed 6 months into our relationship fast, I knew. But it felt right. I said yes without hesitation. I should have paid attention to the warning signs. The way he never wanted to meet my family, always finding excuses to avoid visits. The way he tensed whenever I brought up anything personal about my childhood. The way he steered conversations away from my sister whenever her name came up. I told myself he was just private, that he wanted to focus on us, on our future. I didn't know that 6 months before I met him, David had been at a bar in downtown Boston after a different conference. I didn't know that Melissa had been there too, working her way through a group of finance guys, with her bright laugh and her talent for making men feel important. I didn't know that when someone mentioned they worked with an Angela Stewart, Melissa had leaned in and said with that particular smile she'd perfected over the years, "My sister, she's complicated. Brilliant with numbers, I guess, but she's always been a little unstable. Family stuff, you know. We worry about her." I didn't know that David had absorbed that story, filed it away, built an entire image of me before we ever met. I didn't know that when he approached me at that conference, he'd already decided I was someone who needed saving, someone fragile, someone grateful. I didn't know any of this as I sat in my childhood bedroom with my head shaved and my wedding 2 hours away. I thought I had finally found someone who saw me for me. I didn't know he'd already heard someone else's version of who I was. David had been the one who suggested we have the wedding at my parents' house. "It'll mean something," he'd said, holding my hand across the dinner table at our favourite restaurant in Boston. "A new beginning in the place where you grew up. Closure, maybe." I'd hesitated. The idea of going back there, of celebrating the happiest day of my life in that house full of painful memories, felt wrong. But David had been so earnest, so convinced it was the right thing to do. Besides, he'd added, it will save us money. We can put that toward the honeymoon. That part made sense. I was practical, always had been. So, I'd agreed. I arrived 3 days before the ceremony with 2 suitcases and a heart full of cautious optimism. Maybe this could be a turning point. Maybe my family would finally see me as successful, worthy, lovable. Maybe marriage would transform me in their eyes, from the unwanted burden into someone who mattered. My mother opened the door, wearing an apron and a smile I hadn't seen in years. "Angela, sweetheart," she said, pulling me into a hug that lasted just a beat too long. Come in. I've been cooking all morning. Your favourite pot roast with those little potatoes you always loved." I couldn't remember the last time she'd cooked my favourite anything. I stood in the entryway, confused by this sudden warmth, this unexpected affection. "Mum, you didn't have to go to all that trouble." "Nonsense," she said, taking my suitcase. "It's your wedding week. My daughter's getting married. Of course I'm going to make a fuss." She linked her arm through mine and guided me toward the kitchen. "Melissa's here too. She's been such a help with the preparations." My sister was sitting at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone. She glanced up when we entered, offered a tight smile, then returned her attention to the screen. That was more like the Melissa I knew present, but distant, engaged with her device rather than with people. Still, even her presence felt like an olive branch. She'd taken time off work to be here. That had to mean something. Over the next 2 days, my mother continued her performance of doting maternal care. She made my bed with fresh sheets that smelled like lavender. She asked about my dress, my flowers, my menu choices. She wanted to know everything about David, where we'd met, what he did, whether he treated me well. I found myself opening up, sharing details I'd kept private for months, desperate for this connection I'd craved my entire life. My father was quieter, but that was normal. He'd never been much of a talker. He nodded approvingly when I showed him pictures of the venue. Set up, clapped me on the shoulder once and said, "Good for you, Angela. You did all right." It was such a small gesture, but it made my throat tight with emotion. I wanted so badly to believe this was real. Melissa remained an enigma. She helped with tasks when asked, folding napkins, arranging flowers, but she rarely spoke unless spoken to. On the second evening, I walked past her room and saw her door slightly ajar. She was sitting on her bed, phone in hand, watching something intently. I almost kept walking, but curiosity made me pause. I leaned closer, trying to see what held her attention so completely. The video on her screen showed a bride with a shaved head getting ready for her wedding. Beautiful makeup, elegant dress, but completely bald. The title read, "Wedding Hairstyles for Bald Brides, You're Still Beautiful." My stomach twisted. Why would Melissa be watching that? I must have made a sound because she looked up sharply, our eyes meeting through the gap in the door. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then she smiled a strange, knowing smile that made my skin prickle and closed her phone. "Just browsing," she said lightly. "The algorithm shows you the weirdest things." I forced a laugh and moved on, but the image stayed with me. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in my childhood bed, staring at the ceiling, telling myself I was being paranoid. The wedding stress was getting to me. I was seeing threats where there were none. My family was finally being kind. I should be grateful, not suspicious. Around 2 a.m, I heard voices drifting up from downstairs. Soft, conspiratorial whispers that shouldn't have been happening at this hour. I sat up listening. My mother's voice low and urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't a casual late-night chat. This was something secret. I slipped out of bed and crept to my door, opening it slowly to avoid the creak I remembered from childhood. The voices grew clearer as I moved down the hallway, staying close to the wall. My mother was in the living room talking on her phone. I positioned myself at the top of the stairs, hidden in shadow, and listened. Yes, I understand, my mother was saying. "Tomorrow morning, before the makeup artist arrives." A pause. "No, she doesn't suspect anything. She's been so happy, so trusting. It's almost pathetic." Another pause. The fortune teller was very clear. "If she marries before Melissa, the curse will destroy everything we've built. This is the only way to break it. We have to humiliate her, make her unmarriageable. It's the only way to save this family." My heart stopped. I pressed my hand against my mouth to keep from making a sound. This couldn't be real. My mother couldn't be planning to sabotage my wedding based on some superstitious nonsense from a fortune teller. "I know it seems cruel, my mother continued, her voice dropping even lower. "But she's always been the problem. From the day she was born, this fixes everything." I should have run. I should have grabbed my things and left that house immediately. But I couldn't move. I stood frozen at the top of those stairs, my mind refusing to accept what my ears had just heard. Eventually, I crept back to my room and lay in bed shaking. I told myself I'd misheard. I told myself my mother loved me. I told myself lies until the scissors proved me wrong. The shaving wasn't finished. That's what I didn't understand at first. When I looked in the mirror and saw my ruined head, I thought the worst was over. I was wrong. My mother set down the scissors and picked up something else from the dresser. A small ceramic bowl I recognized from the kitchen, the one she used for salt. She dipped her fingers into it, and before I could process what was happening, she was sprinkling the coarse white grains across my scalp. It burned. The salt found every tiny cut, every scraped place where the scissors had been too rough, and it lit my skin on fire. "To cleanse the evil," my mother said, her voice taking on a ritualistic quality that was somehow more terrifying than her earlier laughter. She rubbed the salt in with her palms, grinding it into my raw scalp. I screamed and tried to jerk away, but my father still had my wrists and Melissa's hands pressed down hard on my shoulders. "Hold still," my father said. Then he began to speak, his voice flat and rehearsed, like he was reading from a script he'd memorized. "We cast out the demon of jealousy that lives in this child. We cast out the curse that threatens to destroy our family. We cleanse her of the evil that has poisoned her since birth. By this act, we break the fortune teller's prophecy. By this sacrifice, we save ourselves." It wasn't a real prayer. It was gibberish, superstitious nonsense dressed up in religious language. But they believed it. I could see it in my mother's face in the fervent way my father spoke. They genuinely thought they were performing some kind of protective ritual, that destroying me on my wedding day was an act of family preservation. Through my tears, I saw Melissa behind me, her phone held up recording everything. The angle captured my face in the mirror, the salt on my head, my mother's hand still moving in small circles. My sister's expression was blank, almost bored, like she was filming a cooking video instead of documenting my humiliation. "Stop," I sobbed. "Please, Melissa, make them stop." She didn't lower the phone. She didn't even blink. When they finally released me, I lunged for the door, but my father was faster. He grabbed my wedding dress from where it hung on the closet door and handed it to my mother. "She won't be needing this, hey?" he said. My mother bundled the white silk and lace into her arms, like it was laundry. "I'll return it," she said pleasantly. "Maybe we can get some of the deposit back." Then they pushed me into the adjoining bathroom and shut the door. I heard the lock click from the outside, the old-fashioned kind, with a skeleton key that my father had installed when I was a teenager. I'd always thought it was strange to have a lock that worked from the outside. Now I understood. They'd been preparing for this or something like this for years. I pounded on the door. "Let me out! You can't do this!" My mother's voice came through the wood, muffled but clear. "Calm down, Angela. You're being hysterical. We're doing this for your own good." I heard my phone ringing in the bedroom. David. It had to be David. He'd be calling to check in to tell me he loved me, to confirm the final details. I screamed his name, begging someone to answer to tell him what was happening. The ringing stopped. Through the door, I heard Melissa's voice, sweet and concerned. "David, hi, it's Melissa. No, Angela can't come to the phone right now. She's not well. She had some kind of episode this morning, and we're very worried about her." The wedding, a pause. "I'm so sorry, David, but I think we need to call it off. She's not in any state to get married today. Yes, I know it's terrible timing. We're heartbroken too. I'll have her call you when she's feeling better." I screamed until my throat was raw. I kicked the door until my feet ached. I looked around desperately for another way out, but the bathroom window was too small and too high. There was nothing in here but a toilet, a sink, and the cruel irony of a mirror I couldn't bear to look into. I don't know how long I was in there. Maybe an hour, maybe 2. Time stopped meaning anything. Eventually, I heard sirens. Someone must have called the police. Maybe a neighbour heard me screaming. For one brilliant moment, I felt hope surge through my chest. The police would help. They'd make my family let me out. They'd see what had been done to me. I heard the front door open downstairs. My mother's voice warm and concerned. "Officers, thank goodness you're here. I'm so sorry about the disturbance." "We got a call about someone in distress," a male voice said. Yes, it's my daughter," my mother said, and I could hear the tears in her voice now, the perfect imitation of maternal worry. "She has episodes, mental health issues. We've been dealing with it for years. This morning she had a complete breakdown. She was supposed to get married today, but I think the stress was too much for her." "Is she here now?" another voice asked. "In the bathroom. We had to lock her in for her own safety. She was hurting herself." I heard footsteps on the stairs. My father's voice joined my mother's. "We found her with a razor," he said. "She'd cut off all her hair. We tried to stop her, but she was out of control." The key turned in the lock, the door opened. 2 police officers stood there in uniform, and behind them I could see my mother's face, composed and sorrowful, every inch the concerned parent. My father held something in his hand, the razor from the bathroom drawer, the one he'd apparently planted there while I was screaming. The officers looked at me. I looked back at them, knowing what they saw. A bald woman in a bathrobe, eyes red and swollen from crying, face blotchy with rage and grief. I looked exactly like someone who'd had a psychotic break. "Ma'am," one of them said gently, "are you all right? Do you need medical attention?" I opened my mouth to tell them the truth, to explain what my family had done. But my mother spoke first. "She did this to herself, officers. Look, we found the razor in her hand." She nodded toward my father, who held up the evidence. "We're worried she might try to hurt herself again. We want to help her, but we don't know what to do." The officer looked at the razor, then at me, then at my mother's tear-streaked face. I saw the exact moment he made his decision about who to believe. "Mom," he said to me, his voice kind but firm. "Have you been taking your medication?" I hadn't been taking medication. There was no medication. But denying it would only make me look worse. I stood there, trapped in a story someone else had written, unable to speak, without confirming their lies. The police stayed for 20 minutes. They talked to my parents in low, sympathetic tones. They suggested I see a doctor. They left their card. And then they left satisfied that this was a family matter, a mental health issue, nothing criminal. When they were gone, my mother unlocked the bathroom door again. "You can come out now," she said. "The wedding's cancelled. Everyone's been notified. You should probably leave." Sir. I walked past her without a word, gathered my things from my room, and left that house for what I thought would be the last time. They didn't just take my hair. They took my voice, my wedding, and my sanity in the eyes of the law. But they made one mistake. They left me alive. I don't remember getting to my car. I don't remember the drive. One moment, I was standing in that hallway with my suitcase, and the next, I was parked on a side street 3 miles away, shaking so hard I couldn't grip the steering wheel. I'd grabbed a scarf from my suitcase and wrapped it around my head, but it kept slipping. Every time I adjusted it in the rearview mirror, I caught a glimpse of what they'd done to me and felt sick all over again. I needed to call David. He would understand. He would help me make sense of this nightmare. My hands fumbled with my phone, nearly dropping it twice before I managed to pull up his number. It rang once, twice, 3 times, then voicemail. His voice warm and professional, asking me to leave a message. I tried again, voicemail, again, voicemail. He was avoiding me. Melissa had told him I'd had a breakdown and he believed her. Of course he believed her. Why would my own sister lie about something like that? I scrolled through my contacts with trembling fingers, looking for anyone who might help. Most of my co-workers were casual acquaintances at best. I'd never been good at making friends, never learned how to let people close. But there was Rachel. We'd been roommates in grad school, stayed in occasional touch over the years. She'd always been kind. She would listen. I pressed her name and waited, holding my breath. "Angela." Her voice was cautious, uncertain. "Is everything okay? I heard about the wedding." Relief flooded through me. She knew. Maybe she could help me figure out what to do next, where to go. "Rachel, something terrible happened. My family. Angela," she interrupted gently. "I heard you had a breakdown. Your sister called me. She said you weren't well, that you'd been under a lot of stress. I'm so sorry. Have you talked to a doctor?" The words hit me like a physical blow. My sister had called her. Had called everyone, probably. Spinning the story, making sure the narrative was set before I could tell the truth. "I didn't have a breakdown," I said, hearing the desperation in my own voice and hating it. "They did this to me. They shaved my head and locked me in a bathroom and told the police I was crazy. Rachel, you have to believe me." There was a long pause. Too long. Okay, she said finally in that careful tone people use with the unstable. Angela, I think you should get some help. Real help. Maybe check yourself into somewhere you can rest for a few days. She thought I was insane. They'd all think I was insane. I ended the call without saying goodbye. For a long time, I just sat in my car watching people walk past on the sidewalk. Normal people going about their normal lives. A woman with a stroller, a teenager on a skateboard, an elderly couple holding hands. The world was continuing as if mine hadn't just ended. Eventually, I started driving again with no destination in mind. The scarf kept slipping. I pulled over twice to rewrap it, my fingers clumsy and numb. It was still morning, not even 10 o'clock yet. I was supposed to be getting my hair and makeup done right now. I was supposed to be laughing with bridesmaids I'd carefully selected, sipping champagne, taking photos. Instead, I was a ghost wandering through my own life. I ended up at the Greyhound station downtown. I'm not sure why. Maybe because it was public enough to feel safe, but anonymous enough that no one would question me. I bought a coffee I didn't drink and sat on one of the hard plastic chairs staring at nothing. Hours passed. The coffee went cold. People came and went, dragging suitcases, checking schedules, living their lives. As evening fell, a security guard approached me. "Miss, are you waiting for a bus?" I shook my head. He looked at me for a long moment, taking in the scarf, the expensive purse that didn't match my hollow eyes, the coffee cup I'd been holding for 6 hours. "You can't stay here all night," he said, not unkindly. I nodded and moved to a bench outside under the overhang. The temperature was dropping. I wrapped my coat tighter and tried not to think about where I would go when morning came. An older man sat down on the other end of the bench. He had a warm backpack and layers of clothes that marked him as homeless. We sat in silence for a while. Then he pulled out a paper bag and unwrapped something inside a sandwich slightly squashed. He tore it in half and held out a piece to me. "You look hungry, he said simply. I hadn't eaten all day. I hadn't even thought about food. But looking at that half sandwich, that small gesture of kindness from a man who had nothing, something inside me broke open. "Thank you," I whispered, taking it. We ate in silence. The bread was dry, the filling just peanut butter, but it was the most meaningful meal I'd ever had. "Whatever they did," he said after a while, not looking at me, "don't let them win." I turned to stare at him. "What? I don't know your story," he said, "but I know that look. Someone broke you today. Don't let them keep you broken." He stood up, shouldered his backpack, and walked away into the night, leaving me alone with his words and half a sandwich and the sudden, crushing awareness that I had $180,000 in the bank, but felt poorer than the man who gave me bread. I had $180,000 in the bank, but in that moment, I was poorer than the man who gave me bread. That night on the bench changed something fundamental inside me. When dawn broke over the bus station, I was still sitting there, but I wasn't the same woman who'd fled my parents' house the morning before. The homeless man's words had worked their way under my skin like a splinter I couldn't ignore. Don't let them win. Don't let them keep you broken. I used my phone to search for rooms to rent. Not apartments, those required references, background checks first and last month's rent. Rooms. The kind advertised on Craigslist by people who didn't ask too many questions. I found one in Dorchester, 40 minutes from my old life, in a neighbourhood I'd never had reason to visit. $200 a week, cash-shared bathroom down the hall. The landlord was a tired-looking woman in her 60s, who glanced at my scarf, at my expensive purse, and asked only one question. "You in trouble?" "Not the kind you're thinking," I said. She handed me a key. First week, up front. No drugs, no lawyers after 10, no overnight guests. The room was barely bigger than a closet. A single bed with a thin mattress, a dresser with a broken drawer, a window that looked out onto a brick wall. There was a mirror on the back of the door, age-spotted and slightly warped. I caught my reflection as I set down my suitcase and immediately looked away. But I couldn't avoid it forever. Eventually, I unwrapped the scarf and forced myself to look at what they'd done. The job was worse than I'd realised in my parents' bathroom. Patches of hair remained uneven and ridiculous, like my mother had gotten tired halfway through her ritual. My scalp was still red in places where the salt had burned. I looked like someone who'd lost a fight with a lawnmower. I stood there for a long time staring at this ruined version of myself. Then I went to the shared bathroom, found a disposable razor under the sink, and locked the door behind me. If my hair was going to be gone, it would be because I chose it, not them. I shaved my head completely, slowly and carefully, watching in the bathroom mirror as I erased the last traces of their cruelty and replaced it with something clean, something deliberate. Each stroke of the razor was an act of reclamation. When I finished, my head was smooth and bare, and for the first time since yesterday morning, I felt like I could breathe. They had tried to destroy me with this act. I was transforming it into armor. Back in my room, I opened my suitcase and found the leather notebook I'd brought for wedding planning. All those careful lists, seating arrangements, vendor contacts, timeline for the day, now completely meaningless. I tore out those pages, every single one, and let them fall into the small trash can beside the bed. Then, I turned to a fresh page and wrote 4 names in neat capital letters, one below the other, leaving space between each. Mom, Dad, Melissa, David. My first instinct was to write what I wanted to do to them, how I wanted to hurt them. But as I sat there with my pen hovering over the paper, I realized that wasn't the right question. Hurting them would be easy. Hurting them would be satisfying for about 30 seconds, and then I'd be just like them, cruel, petty, vindictive. No, I needed to be smarter than that. Under each name, I wrote the same question: what are they most afraid of losing? For my mother, the answer came immediately. Respectability, her standing in the community, the carefully constructed image of the perfect family she'd spent decades building. My father, control. He'd spent his entire life manipulating situations and people to maintain his position as head of the household. Strip away his authority and he'd crumble. Melissa, beauty, status, the adoration she'd always received for being the pretty one, the charming one, the daughter who didn't embarrass them. David, his reputation, his professional image, the carefully curated life he'd built in the finance world, where perception was everything. I stared at those 4 questions and felt something cold and clear settle into my chest. This wasn't about revenge in the traditional sense. It wasn't about making them hurt the way I hurt. It was about making them understand what it felt like to be powerless to watch everything they valued slip through their fingers while they stood helpless to stop it. But first, I needed to disappear. I needed them to think they'd won, that they'd broken me so completely I'd simply vanished from their lives. While they relaxed, while they congratulated themselves on averting the fortune teller's curse, I would be working, planning, building my counterattack from the shadows. I opened my laptop and started applying for jobs. Not finance jobs, those would require references, would leave a trail back to my old life. Cleaning jobs. Night shift positions at office buildings where I could work alone, and no one would care about my bald head or my lack of recent employment history. I needed income that wouldn't show up on any radar my family might be watching. Over the next 3 days, I applied to 42 positions. I got callbacks from 7. I accepted all 7, planning to work as many hours as I could physically manage. My old life, the one where I was a senior financial analyst with a 401k and health insurance, that person was gone. I was building someone new, someone harder, someone they would never see coming. I stopped eating out, stopped buying anything that wasn't absolutely necessary. Every dollar I earned went into my savings account, adding to the $180,000 I already had. That money was my weapon. That money would buy me the time and resources I needed to take everything from them piece by piece, exactly the way they'd taken everything from me. Late at night, unable to sleep, I would open my notebook and stare at those 4 names and 4 questions. I'd add small details as they occurred to me. Facts I remembered, weaknesses I'd observed over the years. I was building a map of their vulnerabilities, and soon I would know exactly where to strike. Revenge isn't about hurting them. It's about making them feel what I felt: powerless. One of the 7 jobs I accepted was at Chen and Associates, a small law firm in the financial district. The night shift paid $12 an hour, nothing compared to what I used to make. But the work was mindless, and the building was empty after 7. I could clean in silence, think my own thoughts, and nobody cared that I was bald or broken or plotting revenge in my head while I emptied trash cans. My supervisor was a man named Luis, who showed me the routine on my first night. Vacuum the offices, dust the desks, empty the bins, clean the bathrooms. Don't touch any papers on the desks, don't open any drawers, don't disturb anything that looks important. The lawyers trusted the cleaning staff to be invisible and discreet. I was very good at being invisible now. For 3 weeks, I followed the routine exactly. I arrived at 8, cleaned until 2 in the morning, went back to my room, slept 4 hours, then went to my morning job at an office building in Cambridge. I was surviving on coffee and spite, and it was working. But on a Tuesday night in late September, I made a mistake that changed everything. I was cleaning one of the partner offices, a corner room with floor-to-ceiling windows, and the kind of leather furniture that costs more than most people's cars. The trash can beside the desk was overflowing, stuffed with crumpled papers and an empty coffee cup balanced precariously on top. When I pulled out the bin liner, it caught on something and tore. Papers spilled across the floor, mixing with the trash. I cursed under my breath and knelt down to sort through the mess, separating what needed to be thrown away from what needed to stay. Most of it was junk food wrappers, printed emails, torn envelopes. But one folder had fallen from the desk itself, landing open with papers fanning out across the carpet. I reached for it automatically, planning to close it and put it back, but my hand froze halfway there. The tab on the folder read, "Estate of Margaret Chen Stewart." Margaret Chen Stewart, my grandmother. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I looked at the closed office door, listened for any sound in the hallway. Nothing. The building was empty except for me and Luis, who was 2 floors down. My hands were shaking as I picked up the folder and opened it fully. The first document was a last will and testament, dated 6 years before my grandmother's death. I scanned through the legal language, my eyes catching on key phrases. Being of sound mind and body, some to my granddaughter, Angela Marie Stewart. And then, in clear black ink, I hereby bequeath my property located at 47 Maple Street, including all contents and furnishings, to Angela Marie Stewart, the house. She'd left me the house. The one my parents sold 6 months after she died, the one they said she'd left to them. The house that was worth, I looked further down the document, $850,000 at the time of her death. My vision blurred. I had to read it 3 times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. But there was more. Clipped to the will was another document, an acknowledgement of receipt dated 3 weeks after my grandmother's funeral. A form stating that Angela Marie Stewart had been informed of her inheritance and had signed to accept it. The signature at the bottom was supposed to be mine. It wasn't. I knew my own signature. I'd signed thousands of documents in my career contracts, approvals reports. This signature was similar, but wrong. The loops were different. The pressure was uneven. Someone had forged it. Someone had pretended to be me, signed away my inheritance, and I'd never known. I felt sick. I sat back on my heels, the folder trembling in my hands, trying to understand what this meant. My parents had stolen from me. Not just stolen, they'd committed fraud, forged legal documents, erased my grandmother's wishes like they meant nothing. I kept digging through the folder, looking for more. And I found it. Buried in the middle of the stack was a medical document. A psychiatric evaluation form from Wellbrook Mental Health Centre, dated 8 years ago. Patient name, Angela Marie Stewart. The form stated that I had been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder and severe depression that I had been hospitalized for suicidal ideation, and that I was deemed mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs. None of it was true. 8 years ago, I'd been working 60-hour weeks at Sterling and Cross, building my career completely stable. I'd never been to Wellbrook, I'd never been hospitalized, I'd never been diagnosed with anything. But someone had created this document. Someone had put it in my file. And I suddenly understood why my mortgage application had been rejected when I was 25, why there'd been that mysterious flag on my credit report. This document had been planted in the system, poisoning my records, making sure that if I ever tried to claim my inheritance or build a life independent of my family, I'd be marked as unstable. The signature at the bottom of the psychiatric form was from a Dr. Richard Chen. I looked at the name on the office door. Richard Chen, partner. The same lawyer who'd handled my grandmother's estate had also signed off on my fake mental health diagnosis. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold the papers. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything, the will, the forged signature, the psychiatric evaluation, every page in that folder. The flash seemed obscenely bright in the dark office, but I didn't care. This was evidence. This was proof. When I'd photographed everything, I carefully put the documents back in order, replaced them in the folder, and set it on the desk, exactly where it had fallen from. I finished cleaning the office in a daze, going through the motions automatically, while my mind raced. They'd been planning this for 8 years. The mental health flag that destroyed my credit when I was 25, that was them setting up the narrative. The hidden will, that was them stealing what my grandmother wanted me to have. The wedding day sabotage, that was just the culmination of a decade-long campaign to keep me small, poor, and powerless. I'd thought the shaving was spontaneous cruelty, a sudden decision driven by superstition and spite. But it wasn't. It was strategic. They needed to destroy my wedding, needed to humiliate me so completely that no one would believe me if I ever discovered the truth and tried to fight back. They'd been building the crazy daughter narrative for years, and the wedding morning was just the final piece of evidence. I walked out of that office building at 2 a.m. with my cleaning cart and my phone full of photographs, and a rage so cold and clear it felt like swallowing ice. They'd been planning this for 8 years. I'd been their victim long before I knew I was in a war. I waited until the next night to make my move. I couldn't risk taking the documents out of the building if they were discovered missing. There would be questions, investigations, and my one piece of leverage would disappear. But I could copy them. The firm had a photocopy room on the 3rd floor tucked away near the supply closet. If I was careful, if I timed it right, no one would even know I'd been there. I went through my usual routine, cleaning the lower floors first, giving the building time to settle into its after-hours silence. Around midnight, when I was certain Luis was occupied on the ground floor, I went back to Richard Chen's office. My hands were steadier this time. I knew what I was looking for. I retrieved the folder from exactly where I'd left it and carried it down the hall to the copy room, my heart hammering against my ribs. The machine hummed to life obscenely loud in the quiet building. I fed the pages through one by one, watching them slide under the bright scanner light. The will, the forged signature, the psychiatric evaluation, every piece of evidence that proved what they'd done to me. I was halfway through the stack when I heard footsteps in the hallway. I froze, my hand still on the copy machine, a half-scanned page glowing under the glass. The footsteps were coming closer. Not Louise's heavy work boots, these were different. Dress shoes, confident, purposeful. A woman appeared in the doorway. She was around 60, with iron-grey hair cut in a sharp bob, and eyes that missed nothing. She wore a navy suit despite the late hour, and she was carrying a briefcase. She looked at me, at the copy machine, at the documents spread across the counter, and her expression didn't change. "Working late?" she asked. My mouth went dry. I should have run. I should have grabbed the papers and made up some excuse. Instead, I just stood there, caught waiting for her to call security or demand to know what I was doing with confidential client files. But she didn't do any of those things. She stepped into the room, set down her briefcase, and looked more closely at the document on the copy machine. I watched her eyes scan the text, saw the moment she registered what she was seeing. "You're the granddaughter, aren't you?" she said quietly. I couldn't speak. I managed a small nod. She held out her hand. "Evelyn Torres. I was Margaret's estate attorney, not Richard me. He took over after I had a stroke 3 years ago." She gestured at the documents. "I'm guessing you found something interesting?" "You knew my grandmother," I whispered. "For 20 years, she was a good woman, and she was very clear about what she wanted for you." Evelyn's jaw tightened. When I came back from medical leave and saw how the estate had been handled, I had questions. Richard said everything was proper, that you'd signed off on everything. I didn't believe him, but I had no proof. Stroke took some of my memory. I couldn't be certain. She picked up the forged signature page, held it up to the light. "This isn't your signature, is it?" "No." "And this psychiatric evaluation?" She tapped the fake diagnosis. "Real." "I've never been hospitalized, never even been to therapy." Evelyn nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something she'd suspected for years. "Then you have a case? A strong one? Fraud, forgery, theft. The question is, what do you want to do about it?" "I want to fight," I said, surprised by how steady my voice was. "I want everything they took from me. I want them to pay for what they did." "It won't be easy. Your parents will have lawyers. They'll drag this out, make it expensive, try to break you down." She paused. "And there's a statute of limitations issue. In most states, you have 3 to 5 years to contest a will. Your grandmother died 6 years ago." My heart sank. "So I'm too late?" "Not necessarily. There's an exception if fraud was concealed. If you had no way of knowing about it, the clock never starts. The concealment itself extends the timeline. With these documents, we can argue you only just discovered the fraud. That gives us grounds to file." Hope flared in my chest, painful and sharp. "You'd help me." "I'd consider it, but I'm not a charity Angela. I'm a lawyer. If we win, and I think we can, I want 30% of the house value. 30% of $850,000. $255,000. It was an enormous amount, but what choice did I have? I couldn't fight this alone. "I'll agree to that," I said, "but I need you to understand something. I don't just want the house. I want them to lose everything they built using my name. The credit they stole, the reputation they destroyed, everything." Evelyn studied me for a long moment, and something that might have been respect flickered across her face. "Now you're thinking like someone who wants to win. Let me make some copies of my own and we'll set up a proper meeting to discuss strategy." We worked in silence for the next 20 minutes, duplicating every document twice. When we finished, Evelyn handed me a business card. "Come to my office tomorrow at 6. We'll talk specifics." I took the card, my hands full of papers that represented 6 years of theft and 8 years of planning. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. This is going to get ugly." She picked up her briefcase. "But your grandmother was my friend, and what they did to her memory makes me angry. Sometimes anger is the best motivation." I left the building at 2:30 in the morning. My cleaning shift finished Evelyn's business card in my pocket. I felt lighter than I had in weeks. For the first time since my wedding morning, I had a weapon. I had proof. I had an ally. The hallway outside Chen & Associates was empty, except for the elevator bank and a few closed office doors. I was nearly to the stairs when one of those doors opened, and a man stepped out, followed by a younger associate. The man was adjusting his tie, looking frustrated and tired, and it took me exactly 3 seconds to recognize him. David. He looked different, thinner. There were dark circles under his eyes. He was saying something to the associate about litigation costs when he glanced up and saw me. We froze, staring at each other across 15 feet of hallway. His mouth opened. I watched him process what he was seeing. The bald head, the cleaning uniform, the complete absence of the woman he'd planned to marry. "Angela," he said. I didn't stop walking. I didn't acknowledge him. I moved past him toward the stairs as if he were a stranger, just another late-night office worker I'd never seen before. "Angela, wait, I can explain." I pushed through the stairwell door and let it close behind me, cutting off whatever he'd been about to say. Through the small window, I saw him standing in the hallway watching me go. And I saw something else too, the associate he'd been with, holding a file labelled Richards v. Chen, breach of contract. Melissa was suing him for the $50,000 they'd promised him to leave me at the altar I'd bet. They were already turning on each other. Good. I walked down 6 flights of stairs and out into the cold October night. I didn't need a hero. I needed someone who understood that justice costs something. Evelyn taught me that justice isn't about fairness. It's about preparation, patience, and leverage. For the next 18 months, I became a student of all 3. I quit the cleaning jobs after 2 months. They'd served their purpose, keeping me invisible, giving me access to the evidence I needed, but they weren't building the future I required. Instead, I found work as a paralegal at a small firm in Cambridge. The pay was modest $38,000 a year, but it came with something more valuable: access to legal databases, court filings, and the kind of procedural knowledge I'd need for what was coming. I told them I was career-changing after a difficult divorce. They didn't ask questions. At night, I worked as a freelance accountant, picking up clients through online platforms. Tax preparation, bookkeeping, financial analysis for small businesses. I could do it from my laptop in my tiny room, and it paid surprisingly well. Some weeks, I made an extra $1,000, sometimes more. Every penny went into my savings account, building on the foundation I'd already established. But I wasn't just working, I was learning. I enrolled in online courses through MIT. Open courseware, contract law, estate litigation, corporate governance. I spent my lunch breaks in law libraries reading case precedents about inheritance fraud. I studied at night until my eyes burned, absorbing everything I could about the legal system I was about to weaponize against my family. Evelyn would quiz me during our weekly meetings, and gradually I stopped needing her to explain the basics. I understood cause of action, burden of proof, discovery process. I was becoming fluent in the language of justice. My hair grew back, slowly at first, then faster, until I had about 3 inches of dark growth that I could actually style. I went to a proper salon for the first time in over a year and asked for something professional. The stylist gave me a sleek pixie cut that made me look sharp and intentional, like a woman who'd chosen this look rather than had it forced upon her. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a victim anymore. I saw someone who meant business. The money accumulated faster than I'd anticipated. By month 6, I had $200,000. By month 12, $240,000. I'd been living on less than $1,500 a month, eating rice and beans, walking, instead of taking the subway, wearing the same 4 outfits in rotation. But I wasn't suffering. I was focused. Every dollar saved was ammunition. Then I made a gamble. One of my freelance clients was a tech entrepreneur trying to get a startup off the ground, an app for supply chain logistics. He couldn't pay me cash, but he offered equity instead. 5% of the company for 6 months of accounting work. Most people would have said no. I looked at his business plan, ran the numbers, and said yes. 3 months later, he got acquired by a larger firm. My 5% turned into $80,000 overnight. I rolled it back into my savings. I now had $320,000, and I was ready to start spending it strategically. Evelyn and I filed the lawsuit against my parents 14 months after our hallway meeting. Theft by fraud, forgery, intentional, infliction of emotional distress. We had the documents, we had the legal theory, and we had the timeline to bypass the statute of limitations. The lawsuit wasn't designed to win quickly. It was designed to put pressure on them, to make them hire lawyers they couldn't afford to let them know I hadn't disappeared. I'd simply been getting ready. But the lawsuit was only part of the plan. I needed to understand what my family had been doing while they thought I was gone. I needed to know their vulnerabilities, their weaknesses, where they kept their secrets. So I started investigating. Carefully. Quietly. I discovered that Melissa had landed a job at Hartman & Klein, a mid-sized investment firm in Boston's financial district. It was a step down from where I'd worked, but respectable. She was a client relations manager, which meant she had access to accounts' confidential information, the kind of role that required trust. I smiled when I found out. Trust was a liability when you had something to hide. I spent a week researching Hartman & Klein's corporate structure. They were privately held, but they had outside investors. Shares traded occasionally on secondary markets, usually in blocks large enough that individual investors could gain meaningful stakes. I found a listing for a $50,000 block of shares being sold by a retiring partner. It would give the buyer about 4% of the company. Enough to matter, but not enough to attract attention. I didn't buy them under my own name. That would have been stupid. Instead, I set up a shell corporation, Stewart Holdings LLC, registered in Delaware, with a bland corporate address. Completely legal, completely anonymous. I transferred $100,000 into the corporate account and purchased not just that initial block, but another one that came available 2 weeks later. By the time I was finished, Stewart Holdings owned 8% of Hartman & Klein, making it the third largest shareholder. 8% meant I had rights. The right to attend shareholder meetings, the right to request information about company performance, and, most importantly, the right to call for an internal audit if I had reasonable suspicion of financial irregularities. I started monitoring Melissa's activity through the access my shares granted me. Client meeting notes, expense reports, travel reimbursements. I was looking for anything unusual, anything that suggested she might be cutting corners or bending rules the way she'd always bent rules growing up. I didn't have to dig very deep. Melissa had always been careless when she thought no one was watching. During our last meeting before the 18-month mark, Evelyn looked at me across her desk and said, "You've changed." "Good or bad?" I asked. "Dangerous," she said, "in the best possible way." She slid a folder across the desk. "The inheritance case is moving forward. We have a court date in 8 months. Your parents have hired representation, but not good representation. They're paying bottom dollar, which tells me they're already feeling the financial pressure. Are you ready for this?" I thought about the woman I'd been 18 months ago, sitting in that bus station, with half a sandwich and no future. I thought about the notebook, with 4 names and 4 questions. I thought about every dollar I'd saved, every law I'd learned, every piece of leverage I'd carefully constructed while they assumed I'd simply disappeared into whatever hole failed daughters fall into. "I'm ready," I said, and I was. My family thought I'd vanished, that their ritual had worked, that they'd successfully erased me from their lives and prevented whatever curse the fortune teller had predicted. They'd moved on, relaxed, let their guard down. They had no idea I'd spent 18 months building a case, buying power, and mapping out every weakness in their carefully constructed lies. They thought I disappeared. I was just learning to become invisible before I struck. The audit request went through Stewart Holdings LLC, signed by a corporate representative whose name meant nothing to anyone, at Hartman & Klein. Just another shareholder exercising their legal rights, concerned about fiduciary responsibility and financial controls. The kind of thing that happened occasionally in private firms when investors wanted reassurance about their money. I worded the request carefully, citing industry standard practices and referencing recent compliance issues at similar firms. I didn't mention Melissa. I didn't mention any specific concerns. I simply asked for a comprehensive review of client account management and expense reporting for the past 18 months. Evelyn had helped me draft it, making sure every word was legally sound and impossible to refuse. The firm's managing partners had no choice but to comply. When you own 8% of a company, you have rights. They hired an external auditing firm, announced the review to staff, and assured everyone it was routine. I'm sure most employees believed that. Melissa probably did too. I knew exactly what they'd find because I'd already found it myself, buried in the expense reports I'd accessed through my shareholder portal. Melissa had been using a client discretionary account, one of those flexible pools of money meant for entertainment expenses, client gifts, relationship building as her personal slush fund. A dinner here, a shopping trip there, a weekend at a spa resort charged as a client retreat, even though no clients attended. Nothing massive, nothing that screamed fraud. Just $12,000 over 18 months of small, careless theft. In a large corporation, $12,000 might have gone unnoticed forever. But Hartman and Klein was small enough that every dollar mattered, and professional enough that this kind of behaviour was terminable. I'd counted on that. The audit took 3 weeks. I waited, working my paralegal job during the day, taking freelance accounting clients at night, living my quiet, reconstructed life. But I'd taken one additional precaution. 2 months earlier, I'd sent Melissa a gift, a designer handbag from a boutique I knew she loved, delivered to her office with a card that read, "From an admirer." Inside, the lining barely detectable, was a small audio device I'd purchased from a surveillance equipment website, the kind private investigators used. Completely illegal to deploy without consent, but I was long past caring about small illegalities when my family had committed fraud, forgery, and theft. The device transmitted to an app on my phone. For 2 months, I'd listened to fragments of her life. Boring client calls, gossip with co-workers, and frequent conversations with David, who apparently had moved on from me to her with impressive speed. They were engaged now, planning a wedding, talking about the future like they hadn't destroyed mine. On a Thursday afternoon in late November, my phone buzzed with unusual activity from the listening device. I was at my paralegal desk reviewing discovery documents for an unrelated case when I heard Melissa's voice break. "What do you mean, I'm being let go?" I closed my office door, put in earbuds, and listened. Her boss, I recognised his voice from shareholder meetings, was explaining the audit findings with the kind of careful corporate language designed to avoid lawsuits, misappropriation of client funds, violation of company policy, termination effective immediately. They'd already called security to escort her out. "It was $12,000, Melissa said, and I could hear tears in her voice. "Over 18 months. It's barely anything. I was going to pay it back." "The amount is irrelevant, Ms. Stewart. The behaviour violates trust. We can't have client relations managers stealing from client accounts." "I wasn't stealing. I was borrowing." "Your badge has been deactivated. Security will help you collect your personal items. I'm sorry it ended this way." The call disconnected. I heard Melissa sobbing, heard her frantically dialing her phone. The first call went to our mother. Mom, they fired me. They said I stole money. They're making me leave right now. Can you... Mom, I need help. I don't know what to do." My mother's response was muffled, but I caught the tone. Disappointment, frustration, not comfort. The second call went to David. He answered on the first ring. "Melissa, what's wrong?" "I got fired. They audited the accounts and found some expenses I shouldn't have charged, and now they're calling it theft. David, I'm scared. What if they press charges? What if this goes on my record?" There was a long pause. Then David said in a voice I'd never heard from him, cold calculated, "You stole from your company. It wasn't stealing. It was just I was going to pay it back. I just needed, how much? 12,000. Another pause longer this time. "I can't be associated with this, Melissa. I have a reputation to protect. This could damage my career." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we should probably take a break until this blows over." "A break, David. We're engaged. We're supposed to get married in 6 months. That was before you committed financial fraud." "It's not fraud." She was crying harder now, her voice breaking on every word. "Please don't do this. You said you loved me. You said..." "I said a lot of things." His voice was flat now, devoid of anything that resembled feeling. "The truth is, Melissa, I only dated you because your parents said they'd give me $50,000 if I left Angela at the altar. They never paid. Said the wedding cancellation meant the deal was void. I've been waiting for that money for almost 2 years. Now you're a liability instead of an asset. So no, I don't think we should get married. The line went dead. Through my earbuds, I heard Melissa's raw, gasping sobs, heard her sink into what sounded like a chair, heard her world fall apart exactly the way mine had 20 months ago. I should have felt triumphant. I'd engineered this. I'd requested the audit knowing what it would find. I'd listened to her destruction in real time, heard her fiancé reveal that he'd never loved her, that she'd been a transaction just like I'd been. But what I actually felt was something colder and stranger. I felt nothing. Or maybe I felt everything, but it was so buried under months of careful planning and strategic thinking that I couldn't access it anymore. I pulled out my earbuds and sat at my desk staring at the wall. David had betrayed Melissa exactly the way he'd betrayed me. My parents had set up both their daughters for pain and humiliation. Melissa had stolen. The way they'd stolen from me learnt their patterns, repeated their sins. I hadn't destroyed them. They were already doing that themselves. I just removed the safety nets and let gravity work. I didn't have to destroy them. They were already destroying each other. 2 weeks after Melissa's termination, Evelyn sent the legal notice. Not the lawsuit itself that was still working its way through the system, accumulating evidence and depositions. This was something more immediate. A notice of claim on the property at 47 Maple Street, my grandmother's house, the one my parents had been living in for the past 6 years, believing it was legally theirs. The notice was formal, typed on law firm letterhead citing the documented evidence of fraud and forged signatures. It informed them that the property belonged to the rightful heir under the terms of Margaret Chen Stewart's last will and testament, and that they were currently in unlawful occupation of said property. They had 30 days to vacate or face eviction proceedings. Evelyn sent it certified mail, so we'd know exactly when they received it. I tracked the package online, obsessively watching it move through the postal system until it was delivered and signed for by my father on a Tuesday afternoon. My phone rang 2 hours later. Unknown number. I didn't answer. It rang again 20 minutes after that. Then again. Then, my mother left a voicemail, her voice shaking with something between rage and panic. Angela, if this is you, you need to stop this immediately. You can't just throw your parents out of their home. We raised you. We fed you. We gave you everything. This is how you repay us. Call us back. We need to talk about this. I deleted the message without listening to it a second time. They hired a lawyer within 3 days. I knew because Evelyn received a letter from Sullivan & Ward, a bargain legal firm that operated out of a strip mall near the highway. The letter argued that my parents had occupied the property in good faith for 6 years, that I'd abandoned any claim by not contesting the will earlier, and that the statute of limitations had expired. It was poorly argued and easily countered. Evelyn responded with a 10-page letter citing the fraud exception and attaching copies of the forged signature and fake psychiatric evaluation. After that, Sullivan & Ward tried to negotiate. That's when Evelyn suggested I attend the negotiation meeting in person. They don't know you're behind this yet, she said. The case is filed under Stewart Holdings LLC, same as your shareholder position. Let's keep you anonymous a little longer. But I think it might be useful for you to see them, to remind yourself why you're doing this. She was right. I needed to see them squirm. I needed to watch them face consequences for the first time in their entitled lives. The meeting was scheduled at Sullivan & Ward's office on a Friday afternoon. I dressed carefully, professional grey suit, white blouse, low heels. I pulled my hair back in a tight bun and put on oversized sunglasses and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed my face. I looked like a corporate lawyer, like someone who dealt with property disputes as a matter of routine business. I looked nothing like the broken bride they'd created 22 months ago. Evelyn introduced me to the opposing counsel as Ms. Chen, corporate representative for Stewart Holdings. My father's lawyer, a middle-aged man with a coffee stain on his tie, barely glanced at me. My parents sat across the conference table, looking smaller than I remembered. My mother had aged, new lines around her mouth, grey streaking through her hair. My father's shoulders were hunched defensive. The lawyer started with his arguments. Good faith occupation, undue hardship. His clients were in their 60s, living on fixed income, had nowhere else to go. Evelyn dismantled each point methodically, but I barely heard the words. I was watching my parents' faces, watching them realise they were losing. Finally, my mother spoke, her voice breaking. Please, whoever you are, whatever company you represent, you have to understand. We're old. We don't have money for a new place. We raised our family in that house. It has memories. Our daughter got married there. The lie was so automatic, so smooth that I almost laughed. I hadn't gotten married there. I'd been mutilated there. Actually, I said, speaking for the first time, your daughter's wedding was cancelled, quite dramatically as I understand it. My mother blinked, confused. I don't see what that has to do with... We have nowhere to go, my father interrupted, leaning forward. If you force us out, we'll be homeless. Is that what your company wants? To put elderly people on the street? I let the silence stretch. Then I said, keeping my voice level and professional, you should have thought about that before you forged legal documents and stole from your daughter. My father froze. I saw the exact moment recognition flickered across his face. He knew that cadence, that way of speaking. He'd heard it for 34 years. Wait, he said, slowly staring at me. Your voice? I said nothing, just sat there perfectly still, letting him work it out. Angela, he whispered. I reached up and removed my sunglasses. Let him see my eyes. Let him see that I was not broken, not crazy, not disappeared. Let him see that I'd been planning this while they slept soundly in the house they'd stolen from me. My mother gasped. Her hand flew to her mouth. Oh my God, I smiled. It was not a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who held all the cards and was about to play them one by one. Hello, Dad. Mum, it's been a while. Angela, sweetheart, listen. My mother started, her voice taking on that familiar, manipulative sweetness. I stood up, put my sunglasses back on and picked up my briefcase. Ms. Torres will be in touch regarding the eviction timeline. I suggest you start packing. You can't do this, my father said, but his voice shook. You're our daughter. You can't just... You're right, I said, pausing at the door. I'm your daughter. The one you shaved bald on her wedding day. The one you locked in a bathroom. The one whose inheritance you stole and whose mental health you forged documents about. That daughter. And actually, I can do this. I have legal, standing documented evidence and a very good lawyer. The only question is whether you leave quietly or whether I make this as public and humiliating as what you did to me. I walked out, leaving them sitting in that shabby conference room with their bargain lawyer and their mounting legal fees and the sudden, terrible understanding that their victim had become their judge. In the elevator, down to the parking garage, Evelyn stood beside me and said quietly, How do you feel? I'm not sure yet, I said, but I knew one thing. The look in my father's eyes when he recognised me hadn't been guilt. It hadn't been shame or remorse or regret. It had been pure animal fear. Fear of what I'd become. Fear of what I might do next. The look in his eyes wasn't guilt, it was fear. And I was just getting started. The invitation came from an email address they didn't recognise. Subject line, family meeting. The message was brief, almost clinical. Dinner at Soralina, Saturday at 7. Come alone. This is your only opportunity to resolve this situation privately. I knew they had come. They were desperate, scrambling, watching their world collapse piece by piece. Melissa was unemployed and avoiding them. Their house was being taken. Their lawyer had essentially admitted the case was unwinnable. They needed a way out, and they'd convinced themselves this dinner was it. That maybe their daughter could be reasoned with, manipulated, guilted into backing down the way she'd always backed down before. They had no idea who I was anymore. I arrived at the restaurant an hour early and spoke with the manager, a woman named Claire, who I'd gotten to know over the past month. I'd been coming here once a week, always alone, always ordering the same table in the private dining section. I tipped well. I was polite. I told her I was planning an important business dinner and wanted everything perfect. "The VIP section is ready," Claire said, leading me past the main dining room to a quiet area separated by frosted glass panels. "Private, just like you wanted. Your other guests haven't arrived yet." "They will," I said. I sat with my back to the entrance, facing the window that looked out over the city lights. I'd had my hair done that morning style, sleek and professional, the pixie cut I'd been growing for months now, perfectly shaped. I wore a black suit with a silk blouse, pearl earrings my grandmother had given me when I turned 21. I looked like someone who belonged in places like this. Someone successful. Someone in control. At 7:03, I heard voices at the entrance. My mother's anxious and uncertain. My father's trying to sound authoritative, but failing. Melissa's wasn't there either. She hadn't been invited or had refused to come. Good. This was about the two people who'd planned my destruction, not their weapon. "We're here to meet someone," my father was saying to Claire. "A family meeting." "Of course. Right this way." I heard footsteps approaching. Heard them stop at the entrance to the VIP section. Heard my mother's confused voice. "Who's the woman at our table?" I turned my head slightly, just enough that they could see my profile. Saw my mother squint, trying to place me. I'd changed so much. The hair, the clothes, the way I held myself. I wasn't their daughter anymore. I was someone else entirely. I stood and turned to face them fully. "Hello, Mother," I said. "Father, it's been a while." My mother's hand went to her throat. My father's face drained of colour. They stood frozen in the doorway like animals caught in headlights, unable to process that the bald, broken woman they'd destroyed had transformed into this. "Angela," my mother whispered. "Please, sit." I gestured to the chairs across from me. "We have things to discuss." They sat slowly, mechanically, never taking their eyes off me. A waiter appeared with water and menus, but I waved him away. "We won't be ordering, just water is fine." When we were alone again, I reached into my briefcase and pulled out 3 manila envelopes. I placed them on the table between us, lined up precisely like exhibits in a courtroom. "Do you know what these are?" I asked. My father reached for the first one, but I put my hand over his, stopping him. His skin felt papery and old. "Don't touch. Just listen." I pulled my hand back and opened the first envelope myself. Slid out the papers inside. "This is grandmother's will, the real one, the one that left me her house, the one you pretended didn't exist." I opened the second envelope. "This is the signature you forged claiming I'd accepted the inheritance and transferred it to you. See how the loops are wrong, how the pressure is uneven. Any handwriting expert would spot this in 30 seconds. The third envelope. And this is my favourite. A psychiatric evaluation claiming I was hospitalised for mental illness 8 years ago. Funny thing, I've never been to Wellbrook Mental Health Centre. I've never been diagnosed with anything. But this document is what you used to flag my credit report to make me unmarriageable to ensure I'd never be able to claim what was mine." My mother was crying silently. Tears running down her face, but she didn't try to speak. "There's one more thing," I said, reaching back into my briefcase. I pulled out a printed document, pages stapled together. "This is a contract between you and David Chen dated 6 weeks before my wedding. It outlines an agreement, $50,000, in exchange for him leaving me at the altar. You were going to pay him to break my heart, to ensure I'd be too humiliated to marry before Melissa did. I watched my father's face carefully. He didn't deny it, didn't claim the document was fake. He just sat there, his jaw working silently, trying to find words that wouldn't come. The fortune teller told you if I married first, the family would be destroyed, I continued. So you decided to destroy me instead. You stole my inheritance. You ruined my credit. You paid my fiancé to abandon me. And when that wasn't enough, when I tried to get married anyway, you shaved my head and locked me in a bathroom and told the police I was insane. My mother finally found her voice. We were trying to protect. No. The word came out sharp as glass. You'll listen now. I've listened to your lies for 34 years. It's your turn. She closed her mouth. I could see her trembling. I'm taking the house. It was mine by law and you stole it. I'm suing you for the full value plus damages. I have evidence of fraud, forgery, and theft. Your lawyer knows you can't win. But this dinner isn't about the legal case. The courts will handle that. I leaned forward slightly. This dinner is about making sure you understand something. I'm not the daughter you destroyed. I'm not weak. I'm not crazy. I'm not going away. And before this is over, everyone who ever knew you will know exactly what you did. My father tried to speak. Angela, please, if we could just... I'm not finished. My voice was perfectly calm, perfectly cold. You're going to lose the house. You're going to lose in court. You're going to pay every dollar you stole from me with interest. And then you're going to live with the knowledge that your own daughter had to become a stranger to survive you. I stood leaving the envelopes on the table. Evidence they couldn't destroy, truths they couldn't erase. Don't contact me again. Everything goes through my lawyer. And if you ever try to claim you did this out of love, remember this moment. Remember that you had a chance to tell the truth, to apologize, to be human. You chose silence instead. I walked past them toward the exit. Behind me, I heard my mother sobbing, heard my father trying to comfort her with empty words. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I just let the truth sit there heavy as a coffin. The video file had been sitting on my laptop for 23 months, encrypted and password protected. I'd copied it from Melissa's phone that morning, after they shaved me during those brief minutes when she'd left it on the bathroom counter while they locked me inside. She'd been so confident, so careless, uploading it to the family group chat with the caption, "Crisis averted." I'd downloaded it before they even realised I'd gotten out. I'd watched it exactly 4 times. Once that first night in my rented room, to confirm what I remembered was real. Once 6 months later when I was building my case with Evelyn. Once before the lawyer's office confrontation. And once after the restaurant dinner to remind myself why I was doing this. Each viewing left me shaking, nauseous, but also more certain that this video needed to exist beyond the dark corners of my private revenge. This wasn't just about my family anymore. This was about every daughter who'd been told she was too much or not enough, every woman who'd been silenced and shamed and made to believe she deserved it. But I needed to know I wouldn't end up in legal trouble for releasing it. I sat in Evelyn's office on a Tuesday morning, my laptop open between us, the video file queued but not playing. Before I do anything with this, I need to know. Can they sue me? Can they claim invasion of privacy? Or try to get me arrested for distributing it? Evelyn looked at the screen, then at me. Show me the video first. I pressed play. The angle was slightly tilted. Melissa had propped her phone against something on the dresser. The video showed everything. My face in the mirror, eyes closed, trusting. My mother's hands with the scissors. The first cut. My scream. My father holding my wrists. Melissa's shadow in the frame watching. My mother's laughter, crystal clear in the audio. Now you look like the curse you are. And then later, when I was begging them to stop, You thought we'd actually celebrate you. The video was 2 minutes and 43 seconds long. Evelyn watched the whole thing without speaking, her face set in hard lines. When it ended, she sat back in her chair. They filmed you without consent during an assault. That recording is evidence of a crime assault, battery, false imprisonment, possibly more. And Melissa already distributed it to a private group, which means they gave up any expectation of privacy the moment they shared it. You're not stealing private content. You're making public what they tried to hide. So, I'm protected. Under truth defense, yes, this is documentation of an actual event. It's not defamation if it's true. And given that you're already in litigation with them, you can argue this is relevant evidence being disclosed as part of ongoing legal proceedings. She paused. But Angela, you need to understand what you're opening yourself up to. Once this is out there, you can't take it back. People will see you at your most vulnerable. They'll have opinions. Some will be cruel. They can't be crueler than my own family was. Fair point. Evelyn closed the laptop. If you're going to do this, do it strategically. Post it with context. Tell your story. Don't let anyone else control the narrative. I spent 2 days writing the caption. I rewrote it 17 times, trying to find the balance between raw emotion and clear facts. In the end, I kept it simple. This is what my family did to me on my wedding morning, because a fortune teller told them I was a curse. They shaved my head, locked me in a bathroom, and told police I was mentally ill when I screamed for help. They'd spent 8 years forging documents to steal my inheritance and destroy my credit. This video was filmed by my sister and shared in our family group chat with the caption, "Crisis averted." I'm sharing it now because shame only has power in silence. My name is Angela Stewart, and I'm done being silent. I posted it at 9 o'clock on a Wednesday night to a new social media account I'd created just for this purpose. I used my real name, my real face. No more hiding, no more invisibility. Within an hour, it had 300 views. By morning, 30,000 and by the end of the second day, 2 million. The comments section became a war zone. Some people called me brave. Others questioned why I'd waited so long to come forward. Armchair psychologists debated my family's motives. But mostly, the comments were from women. Hundreds, then thousands of women sharing their own stories of family abuse, of being scapegoated, of having their hair cut as punishment or control. My mother did this to me when I was 12. My father shaved my sister's head for dating someone he didn't approve of. I thought I was the only one. The media picked it up on day 3. Local news first, then regional, then national. Woman exposes family's shocking wedding day abuse. I ignored interview requests. I didn't need to say anything more. The video spoke for itself. My parents' lives imploded faster than even I had anticipated. They both worked in education, my mother as a school administrator, my father as a substitute teacher. By the end of the week, both had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The school board couldn't be associated with people who'd committed documented abuse. They were fired within 10 days. Their neighbours, the ones who'd probably heard me screaming that morning and done nothing, suddenly became moral arbiters. I saw posts on community forums calling them monsters, demanding they move out of the neighbourhood. Someone spray-painted child abusers on their garage door. I didn't feel sorry for them, but the response that broke through my carefully constructed armour came 2 weeks after I posted the video. An email from a woman named Patricia Clarkson, director of a domestic violence nonprofit called Voices Rising. Ms. Stewart, your video has sparked something extraordinary. In the past 2 weeks, 47 women have contacted our organisation to report family abuse they'd never spoken about before. Most of them specifically mentioned your video as the reason they finally felt able to come forward. We're planning a survivor event next month, and we'd be honoured if you'd consider speaking. Your story is giving others permission to tell theirs. I read the email 3 times sitting at my desk in the paralegal office, where I still worked during the day, still playing the role of the quietly rebuilding woman. 47 women. 47 people who'd been carrying shame that didn't belong to them, just like I had. I'd thought posting the video was about revenge, about making my family face public consequences for private crimes, about taking back the power they'd stolen from me. I thought I was just saving myself. I didn't know I was giving others permission to speak. 8 months later, after countless depositions, document reviews, and legal motions, the court date finally arrived. I'd waited 2 years and 8 months for this moment. I could wait 1 more day, except I couldn't sleep the night before. I lay in my apartment. I'd moved out of that rented room 6 months ago, into a modest 1-bedroom in Cambridge, and stared at the ceiling, running through everything that would happen. Evelyn had prepared me thoroughly. She'd walked me through every possible question, every angle the defence might take, every procedural detail. But knowing what to expect didn't calm the anxiety humming through my veins. The civil trial was scheduled for 9 a.m. at Suffolk County Superior Court. I dressed in a navy suit, pulled my hair back neatly, and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked like someone who had their life together. I looked nothing like the woman who'd slept at a bus station with nothing but shame and half a sandwich. Evelyn met me outside the courthouse. "Ready?" she asked. "As I'll ever be." My parents were already inside with their lawyer. We didn't speak, didn't make eye contact. We simply took our places on opposite sides of the courtroom like opposing armies before battle. The trial lasted 3 days, but the outcome was never really in doubt. Evelyn presented the forged documents, the fake psychiatric evaluation, the will that clearly stated my grandmother's intentions. She called a handwriting expert who testified that the signature on the inheritance acceptance form was not mine. She presented my credit reports showing the fraudulent mental health flag that had been planted 8 years ago. The evidence was overwhelming, irrefutable, damning. My parents' lawyer tried to argue that they'd acted in good faith, that there had been a misunderstanding about the will's terms. But when Evelyn put my father on the stand and asked him directly, "Did you forge your daughter's signature on this document?" he couldn't lie under oath. He stared at the paper for a long time, then whispered, "Yes." The judge, a woman in her 60s with steel grey hair and no-nonsense demeanour, didn't hide her disgust. When she delivered her ruling on the 3rd day, her voice was cold and precise. "I find in favour of the plaintiff, Angela Stewart. The evidence clearly demonstrates that the defendants engaged in fraud, forgery, and theft of inheritance. The property located at 47 Maple Street is hereby returned to Ms. Stewart as originally intended by the deceased Margaret Chen Stewart. Furthermore, the defendants are ordered to pay $300,000 in damages, $200,000 for the value lost over 6 years of unlawful occupation, and $100,000 for emotional distress and punitive damages. This court finds the defendants' actions to be particularly egregious, given the familial relationship and the calculated nature of their deception." I sat very still, listening to those words make my victory official. Behind me, I heard my mother crying quietly. I didn't turn around. But the civil trial was only the beginning. 3 weeks later, the criminal hearing began in the same courthouse, different judge. This time, my parents faced charges of assault, battery, forgery, and fraud. This time, the prosecutor was a sharp woman in her 40s named Rebecca Torres, no relation to Evelyn, who'd built her career on domestic violence cases. The video was played in court. I had to sit there and watch it again on a large screen, watch myself being held down and mutilated while my mother laughed. Several people in the gallery gasped. One woman walked out. The judge's expression never changed, but her knuckles went white where she gripped her gavel. Then came the testimonies from the other women who'd come forward. 12 of them, ranging in age from 19 to 63, who'd contacted Voices Rising after seeing my video. They weren't testifying about my case. Specifically, they were testifying as character witnesses, establishing a pattern of how family abuse operates in silence, how victims are trained not to speak, how seeing one person break that silence gives others courage. A woman named Sarah, 41, testified that her father had shaved her head when she was 16 for staying out past curfew. She'd never told anyone until she saw my video. A woman named Jennifer, 28, testified that her mother had cut off all her hair the night before her college graduation because she'd chosen a school too far from home. One by one, they stood in that courtroom and proved that what happened to me wasn't an isolated incident of family dysfunction. It was part of a larger pattern of control, abuse, and shame that happened behind closed doors every day. The prosecutor's closing argument was devastating. The defendants want you to believe this was about superstition, about a fortune teller's warning, about protecting their family. But the evidence shows something darker. This was about control, about punishing a daughter who dared to be successful, independent, and happy. They didn't just assault her physically, they systematically destroyed her financial future, her mental health records, her ability to build a life outside their control. And when that wasn't enough, they attempted to destroy her completely on what should have been the happiest day of her life. The judge deliberated for less than an hour. When she returned, she looked directly at my parents. I've presided over many difficult cases in my career, but few have disturbed me as much as this one. The evidence of premeditation, of calculated cruelty, of complete disregard for your daughter's humanity is overwhelming. While I cannot impose jail time for these particular charges, given your lack of prior criminal history, I can ensure you face meaningful consequences. She sentenced them to 18 months probation with strict conditions. Mandatory psychological counselling twice weekly for the first year. Community service at a domestic violence shelter 200 hours each. And a 10-year restraining order prohibiting them from contacting me in any form. You will not call your daughter, the judge said. You will not write to her. You will not approach her. You will not communicate through third parties. If you violate this order even once, you will face immediate incarceration. Do you understand? My father nodded. My mother was crying too hard to speak. I walked out of that courtroom into the bright afternoon sun. Evelyn walked beside me, carrying her briefcase, looking satisfied in the way lawyers do when they've won decisively. You did it, she said. Everything you wanted, the house, the money, justice, public accountability. It's over. I nodded. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt vindicated, satisfied, complete. I'd spent nearly 3 years planning this, working toward this, sacrificing everything for this moment. Instead, I felt hollow, like I'd been running toward a finish line, only to discover there was nothing waiting there but empty space. I walked out of that courtroom with everything I wanted. So why did I still feel empty? 6 months after the court verdict, when I thought I'd finally moved on, Melissa appeared at the foundation's door. I'd named it the Bald Bride Foundation, partly as reclamation, partly as a dark joke I was the only one who fully understood. We operated out of a small office space in Somerville, funded by the settlement money and growing donations from people who'd seen my video. We offered counselling referrals, legal aid connections, support groups, and emergency grants for women escaping abusive family situations. It wasn't much yet, but it was mine. It was purpose. It was the answer to that emptiness I'd felt walking out of the courtroom. I was at my desk reviewing grant applications when our volunteer coordinator, a kind woman named Sarah, who'd been one of the 12 who testified, knocked on my door. "Angela, there's someone here to see you. She doesn't have an appointment, but she says it's personal." Sarah's voice dropped lower. "It's your sister." My hand froze on the mouse. "Tell her I'm not available." I did. She said she'll wait. She's been sitting in the reception area for 2 hours. I closed my eyes and took a breath. The restraining order applied to my parents, not to Melissa. Legally, she could contact me. That didn't mean I wanted to see her. But curiosity won over anger. Or maybe it was something else, the need to close one more door, to finish one more piece of unfinished business. Give me 5 minutes, then send her in. I used those 5 minutes to center myself to remember who I was now. Not the broken bride. Not even the woman who'd won in court. I was someone who'd built something meaningful from destruction. I was someone who helped others. I didn't need anything from Melissa anymore. When she walked through my office door, I barely recognized her. She'd lost weight, too much weight. Her hair, which had always been her pride, hung limp and unstyled. She wore jeans and a plain sweater, no makeup, no jewelry. She looked like someone who'd stopped trying. "Angela," she said, and her voice cracked on my name. "Melissa." I didn't stand up, didn't offer her a chair, just looked at her and waited. She stood there for a moment, seeming to gather courage, then sat down anyway, in the chair across from my desk. "I saw the foundation online. I saw what you're doing. It's really impressive. If you came here for small talk, you can leave." No, I came to..." She started again. "I want to volunteer, here, unpaid, whatever you need. I have time now." A bitter laugh. "I have nothing but time." "Why would I let you volunteer here? You filmed me being assaulted. You helped destroy my wedding. You called my fiancé and told him I was mentally ill." "I know." Her eyes were filling with tears. "I know what I did. I've spent 3 years knowing what I did. And I need to understand why you forgave everyone but me." The assumption in that statement made me angry. "Forgave you think I forgave them?" "You helped them. I heard about it through a neighbour. After they lost their house after the trial, you gave them money to rent an apartment. You paid for their counselling that wasn't covered by the court order. You helped them when you could have let them become homeless." I had done those things. Quietly, through Evelyn, anonymously. Not because they deserved it, but because letting them suffer felt too much like becoming them. That wasn't forgiveness. That was making sure I could sleep at night. But you never reached out to me. Never offered me anything. I lost my job, my fiancé, my reputation. I'm working as a cashier at a grocery store. I had to move back in with them until the restraining order forced them to move. And you never once, she broke off, wiping her eyes. Why was I different? Because you had a choice, I said quietly. Mum and Dad are who they've always been. Toxic, controlling, cruel. I don't excuse it, but I understand it. They're broken, people who break other people. But you were my sister. You knew what it felt like to be the one they hurt, and you chose to help them hurt me anyway. I didn't have a choice, she whispered. Everyone has a choice, not when you're still trapped in the same system I was trying to escape from. Her voice rose desperate. You got out, Angela. You went to MIT, you built a career. You had money saved that they didn't know about. I never got out. I was the golden child as long as I did exactly what they wanted, and the second I didn't... She stopped breathing hard. Did you know they cut my hair once? The question landed like a stone in the still water. I remembered. 13-year-old Melissa coming out of the kitchen with her beautiful hair hacked short, sobbing. I'd been hiding in the hallway. I'd seen it, but never spoken about it. You ran away, I said, to a friend's house, for 6 hours, because Dad wouldn't let me go to a school dance with a boy he didn't approve of. When he dragged me home, Mom was waiting with scissors. Melissa's hands went unconsciously to her hair, touching it like she was checking it was still there. She said it was to teach me that vanity leads to disobedience, that beauty is a tool of the devil. She made me watch her cut it all off while Dad held my shoulders. I felt something shift in my chest. Not forgiveness, not even sympathy exactly, just recognition. I was 13, Melissa continued, her voice barely audible now. And after that, I learned. I learned that if I was good, if I was obedient, if I never questioned them, they'd love me, they'd protect me. When they told me to film you that morning, I didn't want to, but I was so scared of what they'd do if I refused. I was 28 years old and I was still that terrified 13-year-old girl. So you chose them over me. I chose survival, just like you did when you disappeared for 2 years. We both survived the only ways we knew how. She leaned forward. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm asking you to let me do something good. Let me volunteer here. Let me help other women who are where I was, where we both were. I looked at her and saw what I'd refused to see before. My sister hadn't been my enemy. She'd been another casualty of the same war. But that didn't mean I had to let her back into my life. I haven't forgiven anyone, I said finally. Not them, not you. What I did was stop letting you live in my head. I stopped giving you power over my peace. That's not the same thing as forgiveness. I know. And if you think working here will earn some kind of redemption, you're wrong. There's no redemption. There's just moving forward. She nodded slowly. Can I move forward here? I thought about it. About the women who came through our doors carrying shame that wasn't theirs. About how many of them had been both victim and perpetrator caught in cycles they didn't know how to break. About how understanding that cycle didn't erase harm, but maybe it could prevent future harm. You can volunteer, I said, but not with clients. You'll do administrative work, filing, data entry, envelope stuffing, and the second I think you're here for the wrong reasons, you're gone. Thank you, she whispered. Don't thank me. Just show up and do the work. She left my office, and I sat in the silence she left behind, thinking about that 13-year-old girl with scissors at her throat, learning the wrong lessons about love and loyalty and survival. Hurt people, but knowing that doesn't erase what they did. I learned about my parents' lives through fragments, the way you learn about distant relatives you've cut off but can't completely escape. A former neighbour mentioned in passing that they'd moved to a subsidised apartment in Revere. Melissa, during one of our few direct interactions, let slip that they were living on social security and food stamps, that my father's teaching pension had been smaller than expected, that neither could find work after the trial publicity. I told myself I didn't care. They'd stolen from me, abused me, tried to destroy me. Whatever hardship they faced was consequence, not tragedy, justice, not cruelty. But sometimes, late at night, I wondered if I'd gone too far. If posting that video, if pursuing every legal avenue, if taking everything from them had turned me into a different version of the same thing they were. I pushed those thoughts away. I had work to do, real work, important work. The foundation had partnered with Massachusetts General Hospital to provide support services for domestic violence patients in their care. Twice a week, I visited women in the recovery ward, women with broken bones and cigarette burns and stories that made my wedding morning look almost gentle by comparison. I brought them resource packets, listened to their stories, helped them make safety plans for when they were discharged. It was a Tuesday in early March when I saw her. I was walking through the main hospital lobby toward the elevators carrying a box of foundation materials when I felt that peculiar sensation of being watched. I turned my head, and there she was standing near the information desk about 30 feet away. My mother. I almost didn't recognize her. She'd aged a decade in the 4 years since I'd last seen her up close. Her hair, which she'd always dyed a respectable brown, was now completely white and thinning. She was thinner too, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost its substance. She wore a faded coat and carried a worn purse, and she looked like what she was, an elderly woman who'd lost everything. She saw me see her. I watched her body tense, watched her hands grip her purse tighter. For a moment I thought she might approach, might try to speak to me despite the restraining order. Part of me almost wanted an excuse to call security, to have her arrested, to punish her one more time. But she didn't move. She just stood there, frozen, staring at me across the crowded lobby, like I was an apparition she couldn't quite believe was real. People moved between us, visitors, patients, in wheelchairs, doctors in white coats. The normal flow of hospital life, everyone focused on their own emergencies and griefs. None of them knew that 30 feet of linoleum floor separated a mother from the daughter she'd destroyed. I could have walked away, should have walked away. The restraining order prohibited her from contacting me, not the other way around, but the spirit of it was clear. We were meant to exist in separate worlds now. Instead, I stopped walking. I turned fully toward her, and I looked at her, really looked at her. I saw the lines grief had carved around her mouth. I saw the tremor in her hands that might have been age or might have been fear. I saw the way she held herself small and defensive, like someone who'd learned that the world was no longer safe. I saw my mother as she'd become not the laughing woman with scissors, not the manipulative parent who'd stolen my inheritance, but a broken old woman standing in a hospital lobby alone. She didn't look away. To her credit, she held my gaze. I saw her lips move, forming words she couldn't speak. Maybe, "I'm sorry." Maybe, "Angela." Maybe just a prayer. 5 seconds passed, maybe 10. Long enough for me to see every detail of what my revenge had wrought. Long enough for her to see what I'd become. Confident professional, alive, everything she'd tried to prevent me from being. Then, I turned away. Adjusted my grip on the box I was carrying. Walked to the elevator and pressed the button. Didn't look back. Behind me, I heard something, maybe a small sound, maybe nothing. When the elevator doors opened and I stepped inside, I glanced one more time toward where she'd been standing. She was gone. I rode up to the 5th floor and visited 3 women that afternoon. I listened to their stories, helped them fill out restraining order paperwork, promised them they weren't alone. I did my job. I did good work, but the whole time I kept seeing my mother's face. The white hair, the thin shoulders, the way she'd looked at me like I was both her daughter and her judge. That night, I sat in my grandmother's house, my house now in the living room where I'd played as a child, and I tried to feel satisfied. I had everything I'd fought for. The house, the money, the foundation, public vindication, legal justice. My parents had lost their home, their jobs, their reputation, their dignity. They lived in poverty now, isolated and ashamed, exactly as they deserved. I should have felt complete. The revenge I'd planned, so carefully executed, so precisely, had succeeded beyond my wildest expectations. They'd been punished. They'd suffered. They'd learned what it felt like to be powerless and humiliated and erased. But sitting there in the dark, I felt the same emptiness I'd felt walking out of the courtroom. Maybe worse, because now I understood something I hadn't let myself see before. Revenge worked. I'd proven that. Every piece of it had gone according to plan. They'd lost everything they valued, everything they'd been willing to destroy me to protect. But winning hadn't healed the wound. It had just given me something to put over it, like expensive wallpaper covering a crack in the foundation. The damage was still there. The trauma was still there. And seeing my mother broken and aged and afraid hadn't magically restored the years she'd stolen or returned the daughter I used to be, the one who still believed mothers loved their children unconditionally. I'd thought revenge would fill the emptiness. Instead, it had just shown me that the emptiness was never about them. It was about what they'd taken that could never be returned: my innocence, my trust, my belief that family meant safety. You can take everything from the people who hurt you and still not get back what they stole. I thought seeing her broken would heal me. It didn't. It just made me realize revenge is a full meal that leaves you hungry. The hunger that revenge left behind drove me to places I'd been avoiding. Specifically, the attic of my grandmother's house. I'd been living here for 8 months, but I'd barely touched the 2nd floor, let alone the attic. The main level was enough kitchen, living room, the small office, where I did foundation work in the evenings. I slept in my grandmother's old bedroom because it felt like the one place in the house that had ever been safe. But the attic held decades of accumulated family history boxes. My parents had shoved up there and forgotten things they'd left behind when they were evicted, in their rush to pack only what mattered. On a Saturday morning, restless and unable to focus on anything productive, I climbed the narrow stairs and pulled the cord that turned on the single bulb hanging from the rafters. Dust particles swirled in the thin light. Cardboard boxes were stacked against the walls, some labelled in my grandmother's neat handwriting, others unmarked. I started with the labelled ones: holiday decorations, kitchen items, books. I worked through them methodically, deciding what to keep, what to donate, what to throw away. It was easier than I'd expected. Most of it was just stuff, the accumulated weight of a life meaningful, once meaningless now. Then I found a box, marked simply, letters M. M. My mother's initial. I almost put it aside. I didn't want to read my mother's letters. I didn't want to know more about her. I'd already learned too much about what she was capable of. But something made me open it anyway, maybe the same instinct that had made me stop and look at her in the hospital. The need to understand, even when understanding wouldn't change anything. The box was full of envelopes, organised chronologically by year dating back 40 years. My grandmother had kept every letter my mother had ever sent her tied together with faded ribbons in neat bundles. I pulled out the oldest bundle letters from before I was born and sat on the dusty floor reading them one by one. The early letters were ordinary, my mother writing to my grandmother about her engagement to my father, about their small wedding, about their first apartment. The tone was warm, affectionate even. This was a version of my mother I'd never known, young, hopeful, capable of genuine emotion. Then I found the letter that changed everything. The envelope was dated 35 years ago. The paper inside was thin and fragile, covered in my mother's handwriting, messier than usual, like she'd been writing quickly or upset. "Dear Mother Chen," it began. My mother had always been formal with my grandmother, never calling her mum or even Margaret. "I'm writing because I don't know who else to talk to, and I'm so frightened I can't sleep. I went to the doctor yesterday for my checkup. I'm 4 months pregnant now and everything has been fine, but yesterday the doctor did an ultrasound and said he could see the baby clearly enough to tell what it is. It's a girl. I know I should be happy. I know a healthy baby is all that matters. But when I told Robert, his face just went blank. He didn't say anything for a long time, and then he said, 'Another girl.' We already have Melissa. She's only 2 and she's perfect, but Robert has always talked about having a son. His father keeps asking when we're going to give him a grandson. At family dinners, Robert's brothers talk about their boys, about teaching them to play baseball and fix cars. And Robert gets so quiet. Last night, after I told him about the ultrasound, he said something that terrified me. He said, "I can't do this. I can't spend my whole life in a house full of women. If this baby's a girl, I need to think about whether this marriage is what I want." Mother Chen. I don't know what to do. I can't raise 2 children alone. I can't afford it. My parents won't help. They already told me I made my bed when I married Robert. And I love him. I know he can be difficult, but I love him. I'm so scared that when this baby is born, if she really is a girl, he'll leave us. And I don't know if I'll be able to look at her without thinking that she's the reason my marriage fell apart. I know this is an awful thing to think about an innocent baby. I know I should be grateful, but I can't help feeling that this child is already costing me everything and she isn't even born yet. Please don't tell Robert I wrote to you about this. He'd be furious. With love and worry, Catherine. I read the letter 3 times, my hand shaking, tears blurring the words. Another girl. She's already costing me everything. I was that baby, that unwanted girl who'd threatened to destroy her mother's marriage before she'd even been born. I put the letter down and pulled out the next bundle letters from after my birth. My mother's tone had changed, colder, more distant. She wrote about Melissa's accomplishments, barely mentioned me, except to note that I was difficult, or demanding, or nothing like her sister. In one letter, written when I was 3, she said, "Angela cries all the time. I think she knows somehow that she was never supposed to exist. Robert barely looks at her." The story I'd been told that I was the curse, the bad luck, the problem, it had never been about superstition or fortune tellers. Those came later, justifications for feelings that had existed since before I was born. My mother had never wanted me because wanting me meant losing my father. And when he stayed, when he didn't leave despite his disappointment, she'd blamed me anyway. For trapping him in a marriage he didn't want. For being the wrong gender. For existing. Every moment of favoritism toward Melissa, every stolen opportunity, every cruel word, it all traced back to this. To a pregnant woman terrified and desperate, resenting the daughter in her womb for threatening her security. I wasn't the family curse because of anything I'd done. I was the family curse because I was born a daughter when they wanted a son. Because I represented everything my father didn't want and everything my mother feared losing. I sat in that dusty attic surrounded by the artifacts of a life that had been built on rejection from the very beginning, and felt something crack open inside me that had been sealed shut since my wedding morning. All these years, I'd tried to earn their love. I'd studied hard, worked hard, stayed quiet, stayed small, tried to be good enough to deserve the affection they gave Melissa so easily. I'd thought if I could just figure out what I was doing wrong, I could fix it, but I'd never done anything wrong. The problem had never been me. The problem was that I existed. I wasn't cursed. I was just unwanted. And somehow that was worse. The email arrived on a Wednesday afternoon sender name, so familiar it made my chest tighten before I even opened it. David Chen. Subject line, please read this. I stared at it for a full minute before clicking. Part of me wanted to delete it, unread, to let him remain a closed chapter, a mistake I'd learned from and moved past. But curiosity won the way it always seemed to, when it came to the people who'd hurt me. Angela, I know I have no right to contact you. I know I don't deserve your time or attention. But I need to talk to you about something important. It's been 4 years, and I think we both deserve closure. Please, just coffee. 1 hour. I'll meet you anywhere you want, anytime you want. I need you to know how sorry I am. David. I read it twice, looking for manipulation, for hidden motives, for the trap I'd learned to expect from people who claimed they wanted to make amends. But all I saw was desperation poorly disguised as remorse. I could have ignored it. Should have ignored it. But that letter from my mother, she's already costing me everything, had done something to me. It had burned away the last traces of the person who needed to be wanted, who would twist herself into shapes to earn love from people incapable of giving it. I wasn't that person anymore. I typed back a single line, Saturday, 2 p.m. Blue Bottle Coffee on Newbury Street. Public. Busy. A place where he couldn't make a scene and I could leave whenever I wanted. I arrived 15 minutes early and took a table near the window where I could see him coming. I ordered black coffee and sat with my hands wrapped around the cup, watching people walk past on the sidewalk. Couples holding hands, parents with strollers, normal people living normal lives, none of them knowing that 4 years ago I'd been destroyed in a house 3 miles from here. David was 10 minutes late. When he walked through the door, I barely recognised him. The polished finance professional was gone. His hair was too long, streaked with more grey than I remembered, and uncombed. He had a beard now, not a deliberate stylish one, but the kind that grows when you stop caring about appearances. His clothes were rumpled, his eyes had dark circles beneath them, and he'd lost weight in a way that made him look hollow, rather than fit. He saw me and his expression crumbled into something between relief and grief. He walked over slowly like he was approaching something fragile that might disappear. Angela, he said, and his voice cracked on my name. Thank you for meeting me. I wasn't sure you would. Sit down, David. You said you had something important to tell me. He sat, ordered nothing, just folded his hands on the table and looked at me with those tired eyes. You look incredible, successful, strong. I've been following your foundation online. What you're doing is really important. You didn't ask me here to talk about my work. No, I asked you here because... He started again. I lost my job 6 months ago. The firm let me go. Something about ethics violations and undisclosed conflicts of interest. Your video, when it came out, people started asking questions about my relationship with your family. Someone found out about the money, the contract, the $50,000 my parents promised you to leave me at the altar. He flinched. Yes, that. When it came to light, the firm investigated. They found other things. Questionable business practices, nothing illegal exactly, but enough to make me a liability. They fired me. No one in finance will hire me now. My reputation is destroyed. And I've lost everything, Angela. My career, my apartment, my standing in the community. I'm working as a consultant for startups, making 1/10 of what I used to make. I had to move in with my brother. I'm 43 years old, and I'm starting over with nothing. I took a sip of my coffee, waiting for him to get to the point. I've spent the last 6 months thinking about what I did to you, to us, and I realise now that I made the worst mistake of my life when I walked away from you that day. You were the best thing that ever happened to me, and I destroyed it because I was weak and greedy, shy and stupid. He reached across the table like he was going to take my hand. I pulled back. Angela, I know I don't deserve it, but I'm asking, can we start over? Can we try again? I've changed. I've learned. I understand now what I threw away. The silence stretched between us. 4 years ago, this would have been everything I wanted. The man I loved apologising, wanting me back, admitting he'd made a mistake. Now I just felt tired. No, I said simply. Please, just listen. I am listening, David. And what I'm hearing is that you lost your job and your reputation, and now you want to see if the woman you betrayed might be a convenient source of stability. That's not love. That's desperation. That's not fair. I do love you. I always loved you. You loved the version of me that Melissa described in a bar 6 months before we met. The brilliant but unstable woman who needed saving. You loved feeling like a hero. I leaned forward. But you didn't love me. Because if you had, when my family told you I was having a breakdown, you would have answered my calls. You would have questioned their story. You would have believed me. I was scared. They were convincing. You thought exactly what you wanted to think. That I was too much trouble. That staying with me might complicate your perfect life. I pushed my coffee cup aside. David, you didn't lose me because you made a mistake. You lost me because when my family showed you who they were, you believed them more than you believed me. You chose the narrative that made your betrayal easier to justify. I'm sorry, he whispered. God, Angela, I'm so sorry. I'm sure you are. Sorry you got caught. Sorry your life fell apart. Sorry you don't have anyone else to turn to. I pulled a $20 bill from my wallet and placed it on the table. This should cover your drink. It's more than you ever gave me. I stood up. He looked at me with something like panic. Angela, please, don't leave like this. I know what you need, David. The question is, what do I need? And the answer is nothing from you. Not your apology, not your regret, not your attempt to salvage something from the wreckage you helped create. So that's it. After everything we had, we didn't have anything real. We had 6 months of you dating the woman you thought I was, and 1 morning of you abandoning the woman I actually am. There's nothing to salvage from that. I walked out of the coffee shop into the bright afternoon. Behind me, I heard him call my name once weakly, then silence. I walked 3 blocks before the tightness in my chest released. Before I realised that I'd been carrying the weight of his abandonment for 4 years, waiting for him to come back and explain to make it make sense to give me the closure that only he could provide. But I didn't need his closure anymore. I'd found my own. Closure doesn't always come from someone saying sorry. Sometimes it comes from realising you don't need them to. The week after I walked away from David, I made a decision. I was done closing doors. I was done looking backward. It was time to build something forward-facing, something that could take all the pain and rage and emptiness and transform it into something that mattered. The foundation had been operating for months, but quietly, almost tentatively. We'd helped maybe 50 women, connected them with resources, provided small emergency grants. It was good work, but it was small. And I'd learnt something from those 47 women who came forward after my video. There were thousands more like us carrying shame in silence, believing they were alone. I wanted to give them what I'd been given permission to speak. A place to be believed, proof that survival was possible. So I planned a launch event, a proper one. The kind that would announce the foundation not as a side project, but as a real organisation with real reach and real ambition. I worked with a designer on a logo. We went through dozens of concepts before landing on the right one, a crown made from stylised strands of hair, flowing and strong, rendered in gold and silver. Under it, in elegant script, they tried to break me. I became unbreakable. It was bold, maybe too bold, but I was done being subtle. I rented an event space in the South End, a beautiful old converted warehouse with exposed brick and high ceilings. I sent invitations to everyone who'd helped me along the way: Evelyn, the women who'd testified at the trial, advocates from other domestic violence organisations, journalists who'd covered my story responsibly. I invited the women we'd already helped through the foundation, offering them the chance to share their stories if they wanted to, or just to come and be part of something larger than themselves. I didn't invite my family. That chapter was closed. The night of the launch, I stood in the bathroom of the event space, looking at myself in the mirror. My hair had grown long enough now that I could style it properly, swept back in an elegant updo that showed my face clearly, confidently. I wore a simple black dress and the pearl earrings my grandmother had given me. I looked like someone who belonged in this space, who deserved to be here. 4.5 years ago, I'd looked in a different mirror and seen someone destroyed. Tonight, I saw someone who'd built herself back stronger. The doors opened at 6. By 6:15, the space was filling. By 6:30, we were at capacity. 300 people, maybe more. Women of all ages, some with supporters, some alone. Advocates and social workers and therapists. A few journalists, keeping a respectful distance. And faces I recognised from the internet, women who'd commented on my video, who'd shared their own stories in response. I gave a speech. I'd written it and rewritten it a dozen times, trying to find the balance between raw honesty and professional composure. In the end, I kept it simple. 4.5 years ago, my family shaved my head on my wedding morning as part of a ritual they believed would break a curse. What they actually broke was my silence. For 34 years, I'd been taught that I was the problem, that I was too much or not enough, that my existence was somehow wrong. That morning, they tried to make that belief visible. They tried to mark me as broken. But here's what they didn't understand: you can't break someone who refuses to stay broken. You can hurt them. You can humiliate them, you can steal from them and lie to them and try to destroy their future. But if they choose to rebuild, if they choose to transform their pain into purpose, you haven't broken them. You've just revealed your own cruelty. The Bald Bride Foundation exists because I learned something important. My story isn't unique. Family abuse, especially the subtle kind that doesn't leave visible bruises, happens every day. And victims stay silent because they think no one will believe them, or because they've been taught that family loyalty matters more than personal safety, or because they genuinely believe they deserve the treatment they're receiving. This foundation is for everyone who's been told they're the problem, when the real problem is the people who hurt them. We're here to provide resources, legal support, counselling, connections, and most importantly, belief. We will believe you. Your story matters. Your pain is real. And you deserve better than what was done to you. The applause was overwhelming. I stood there blinking back tears, watching 300 people rise to their feet. After the formal program, I walked through the crowd, talking to attendees, listening to their stories. So many stories. A woman whose uncle cut her hair as punishment for talking back when she was 12. A man whose father shaved his head before military school as preparation, even though he'd never enlisted. A teenager whose stepmother controlled her appearance as a way of controlling her identity. Then, an older woman approached me. She was probably in her 60s, well-dressed, with silver hair, cut in a sleek bob. She waited patiently until I finished talking to someone else, then stepped forward. "Ms. Stewart, may I speak with you for a moment?" "Of course. Please call me Angela." "I'm Dorothy," she said, and her voice was shaking. "I saw your video when it first came out. I watched it probably 50 times, and I need to tell you something I've never told anyone." I guided her to a quieter corner of the room. "When I was 20 years old," she said, "I got accepted to Radcliffe College, full scholarship. It was 1983, and I was so proud. I was going to be the first person in my family to go to college. But my mother didn't want me to go. She said education made women unmarriageable, that I was getting above my station, that I was abandoning the family." Dorothy's hands were shaking. I took them in mine. "The night before I was supposed to leave for school, she came into my room with scissors. My father held me down. She cut off all my hair while telling me I was selfish and ungrateful. Then she burned my acceptance letter and said if I left anyway, I'd be disowned." "Did you leave?" I asked quietly. "No, I was too scared, too ashamed. I stayed home, married the man they approved of, had 3 children. It took me 40 years to finally leave that marriage and go back to school. I got my degree at 62. She was crying now. "For 40 years, I never told anyone what she did. I told people I'd cut my own hair, that I'd changed my mind about college. I protected her. And when I saw your video, when I saw you refusing to protect them, refusing to be silent, it broke something open in me that I didn't even know was still locked." "I'm so sorry that happened to you," I said. "Don't be sorry. Be proud. Because what you did, sharing that video, building this foundation, refusing to disappear, you gave me permission to finally tell the truth. You gave me a voice." She hugged me then, this stranger who carried a 40-year-old wound that looked exactly like mine, and I held her while she cried. All around us, similar conversations were happening. Women finding each other, recognizing their pain in each other's stories, speaking truths they'd held silent for years or decades. I looked around that room full of survivors, and something shifted in my understanding of what had happened to me. I thought my story was about me, my family, my trauma, my revenge, my healing. But it wasn't. It was about every daughter who'd been told she was worthless. Every woman who'd been punished for wanting more. Every person who'd learned to make themselves smaller to survive. My story was their story. Our story. I thought my story was just mine. I didn't know it was ours. Understanding that my story belonged to a community of survivors didn't erase my personal history with the people who'd hurt me, but did something unexpected. It made that history feel smaller, less defining. When you realize thousands of women carry similar wounds, your own stops feeling like a life sentence and starts feeling like just one chapter in a longer story. So when Evelyn called me a year after the foundation launch and said, "Your parents want to meet with you," I didn't immediately say no. They contacted me through their lawyer, Evelyn explained. They're aware of the restraining order and they're not asking you to lift it. They just want one conversation. They said they have something to give you. What kind of something? They wouldn't say. But Angela, you don't owe them this. You don't owe them anything. I know, I said, and I did know that was the difference. But I think I'm ready to hear whatever they need to say. We arranged to meet at a small diner in Watertown neutral territory, public enough to feel safe. I arrived first and chose a booth near the window. I ordered coffee and waited surprisingly calm. I wasn't the woman who'd sat across from them in that conference room 4 years ago, coldly presenting evidence of their crimes. I wasn't even the woman who'd locked eyes with my mother in the hospital lobby. I'd moved beyond anger into something quieter. Something like indifference, except not quite. More like acceptance that they were broken. People who'd broken me, and that was simply a fact of my life, not the defining fact. They walked in together, and I barely recognized them. My father moved slowly, leaning on a cane. My mother's white hair was thin enough that I could see her scalp in places. They looked like what they were, elderly people who'd lost everything and aged rapidly under the weight of it. They saw me and stopped, uncertainty crossing both their faces. I gestured to the booth. They sat across from me, moving carefully, like they were afraid of taking up too much space. "Angela, sir," my father said, "just my name." His voice was hoarse. "Dad, Mum." My mother was holding a small wooden box, maybe 6 inches square, clutched in her lap like a lifeline. Her hands trembled. We sat in silence for a moment. The waitress came, asked if they wanted anything. They both ordered water. When she left, my father cleared his throat. "We know we don't have the right to ask for your time. We know what we did was unforgivable." "Then why are we here?" I asked, not unkindly. My mother set the box on the table between us. It was made of cedar old and worn with a small brass latch. "I brought you something. I've had it for 30 years. I should have given it to you a long time ago, but I couldn't." She opened the latch and lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in tissue paper, was a lock of dark hair tied with a faded pink ribbon. "It's yours," she said softly, "from when you were 5 years old. You wanted to cut your hair short, like your friend from kindergarten, and I took you to the salon. The stylist saved this for me." She touched the hair gently, like it was something precious. "I kept this because before I hated you, I loved you. I just forgot how." I looked at that lock of hair, at the evidence that once, a long time ago, my mother had loved me enough to save something from my childhood. It should have meant something. It should have cracked open whatever remained of my anger. Instead, I just felt tired. "Thank you for bringing this," I said, "but I don't need it anymore." "Angela, please," my father started. I held up my hand. "Let me finish. You came here to give me something from my past, something that proves you loved me once, but I don't need proof that you loved me. I know you did, in whatever broken way you were capable of, and I know that somewhere along the way, that love got twisted into resentment and control and cruelty. I've read Mum's letters. I understand why." My mother's face crumpled. "You found those?" "I found a lot of things when I moved into Grandma's house, including the letter where you wrote that you were afraid I'd cost you everything before I was even born." I looked at both of them. "I understand now that I was born into an impossible situation, that you resented me for circumstances I had no control over, that you let that resentment poison 34 years of my life." "We're so sorry," my mother whispered. "We were wrong. We were so wrong about everything. I know you're sorry, and I believe you mean it. But your apology doesn't undo what you did. It doesn't give me back the years I spent thinking I was worthless. It doesn't erase the trauma." "Then why did you agree to meet us?" my father asked. I stood up, preparing to leave. "Because I needed to tell you something face to face. I forgive you, not because you deserve it, not because you've earned it through suffering or apologies, but because I deserve peace, and holding on to anger was keeping me from that." I pulled a $20 bill from my wallet and placed it on the table next to the cedar box. "This covers my coffee. Keep the hair or don't. It doesn't matter to me anymore. What matters is that I'm free. Free from needing your love, your approval, or your regret. Free from the story you wrote about me before I could even speak for myself." "Angela, wait." My mother reached across the table, but I was already stepping back. "Goodbye," I said. Not, "I'll see you again." Just, goodbye. I walked out of that diner into the bright afternoon, and with every step I felt lighter. They'd given me a token of the past, and I'd given them the only thing I had left to give release. Not for them, for me. Forgiveness isn't a gift to the person who hurt you. It's a gift to yourself. I was halfway to my car when I heard his voice behind me. "Angela, wait, please." I stopped, keys in hand, and turned. My father stood in the diner doorway, leaning heavily on his cane. My mother was still inside, visible through the window, her head in her hands. "I said what I needed to say, Dad." "I know, but there's something I need to tell you. Something that might help you understand." He took a few careful steps toward me. Not to excuse what we did, just to explain where it came from. I should have gotten in my car and driven away. I'd given them forgiveness. I didn't owe them understanding too. But something in his voice, a rawness I'd never heard before, made me stay. 5 minutes, I said. He nodded and gestured to a bench outside the diner. We sat, keeping distance between us, two people connected by blood and trauma, trying to find words for things that had been silent too long. "Your grandmother, my mother, she wasn't the kind woman you knew," he began. "When I was growing up, she was different, harder. She'd come from nothing, married my father, who had even less, and she was determined that I would be the one to lift the family up. I was her only son, her only child. Everything rode on me." He paused, staring at his hands. They were spotted with age, trembling slightly. "When I was 8 years old, I came home with a report card. Mostly B's 1C in mathematics. She beat me with a belt until I couldn't sit down. Said an only son who couldn't excel was worthless. That I was wasting the sacrifice she'd made, carrying me, raising me. Every failure after that, every second place, every lost game, every time I wasn't the best, she reminded me that I was a disappointment. That I was supposed to be special because I was a son, and instead I was ordinary." I sat very still, listening. "She used to say I gave up everything for a son and God gave me you. Like I was a cosmic joke, a punishment." His voice cracked. "I learned something from her, Angela. I learned that children aren't people, they're investments. They're supposed to pay back what you put into them. And when they don't, when they're just human beings with their own lives and limitations, you have the right to be angry about it. So you did the same thing to me. Yes, I saw you as the investment that wasn't paying off, the daughter who cost me the son I wanted. And I treated you the way my mother treated me, like you owed me something you could never give." He looked at me finally, his eyes wet. "I didn't know how to love a child without conditions. I was never shown that kind of love." "What about Mum?" He was quiet for a moment. "Your mother's story is hers to tell, but I can tell you what she told me when we were first married. She grew up in a house where sons were everything. Her father had 3 daughters before he finally got a son. She watched her brother get everything, attention, education, inheritance, while she and her sisters were just background. She told me she spent her whole childhood trying to prove she was as valuable as her brother and never succeeding. When she got pregnant with Melissa, she was so happy it was a girl. She thought maybe she could give a daughter what she'd never had. But then I came along. Then you came along. And I made it clear I'm not proud of this. I made it very clear that another daughter was a disappointment, that if we were going to stay married, I needed a son. She was terrified of losing the marriage, of being a single mother in her 30s with no career and 2 kids. So he trailed off. So she chose you over me. She chose survival, just like I was choosing survival when I became my mother. We didn't know how to break the pattern. We just kept repeating it. I looked at this old man beside me, broken down by time and consequence, and saw something I'd never seen before, another victim. Not my victim, someone else's. That didn't erase what he'd done to me, but it put it in context. You know what I realized recently? I said, hate isn't born, it's inherited. Your mother hated you for not being good enough. You hated me for not being a son. And if I don't break it, if I ever have children and let any of this poison touch them, they'll inherit it from me too. That's why you started the foundation. Part of why. I started it to help women like me, but I also started it because I needed to transform all this inherited pain into something that stops the cycle instead of perpetuating it. I stood up. I forgive you, Dad. I meant that. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean having a relationship. It means I'm not going to let what you did to me define the rest of my life. I understand. And I want you to know I'm not going to have children. Not because I'm broken, but because I choose not to. I choose to end this particular line of trauma right here, with me. He nodded slowly. Maybe that's the bravest thing any of us could do. I walked back to my car and sat in the driver's seat for a long time before starting the engine. I thought about my grandmother, who'd beaten her only son for not being perfect. I thought about my mother's father, who'd made his daughters invisible. I thought about how trauma moves through families like a virus, mutating with each generation, but never quite dying out unless someone has the courage to say, not anymore, not through me. Understanding why they hurt me didn't excuse them, but it freed me from thinking I deserved it. Understanding freed me, but it also left me unsettled. For days after that conversation with my father, I felt like I was carrying something heavy that I couldn't quite put down. Not anger anymore. Not even sadness exactly. Just the weight of knowing that pain travels through bloodlines like genetic material passed down from parent to child, invisible but powerful. I needed somewhere quiet to sit with that knowledge. Somewhere I could just be still. I'm not religious. I hadn't been to church since my grandmother's funeral 5 years ago. But on a Sunday morning, I found myself driving to the old Episcopal church near my grandmother's house. My house, now the one with the stone walls and stained glass windows that let in coloured light, even on grey days. I slipped into a back pew during the service, not really listening to the sermon, just letting the ritual wash over me. The standing and sitting, the hymns sung by voices that weren't quite in tune, the ancient words spoken in patterns worn smooth by centuries of repetition. There was something comforting about being in a space where people had been bringing their grief and hope for hundreds of years, where my particular pain was just one small thread in an endless tapestry of human suffering and survival. When the service ended, people filed out, greeting each other, shaking hands with the priest. I stayed seated. The church emptied slowly until it was just me and a few others scattered in the pews. An elderly man near the front, a woman lighting candles in the side chapel, a mother with a small child in the back corner. I didn't pray. I'd never been sure who I'd be praying to, or what I'd ask for. Everything I'd needed, justice, safety, purpose, I'd had to build for myself. No divine intervention had shown up on my wedding morning. No miracle had stopped my family from hurting me. Whatever God might exist hadn't seemed particularly interested in my story, but I sat there in the quiet hands folded in my lap and let myself just exist without doing anything, without planning or strategizing or helping anyone, just being. I don't know how long I sat there before I heard small footsteps approaching. I opened my eyes and saw a little girl, maybe 6 years old, standing in the aisle looking at me with solemn dark eyes. She wore a yellow dress and had her hair in 2 braids tied with ribbons. "Are you sad?" she asked directly, the way children do before they learn that some questions are too personal. I recognised her then, Emma, the daughter of Sarah, one of our foundation volunteers. Sarah had brought her to a few events, and Emma had spent those times colouring in the corner or playing with blocks while the adults talked about difficult things. "Hi, Emma," I said softly. I was sad, but not anymore. She climbed onto the pew beside me, sitting with her legs straight out in front of her feet, not touching the floor. Why were you sad before? Because some people I loved hurt me, and I spent a long time trying to understand why. Did you figure it out? I think so. They hurt me because people hurt them first, and nobody ever taught them how to stop being hurt, so they just kept hurting other people. Emma considered this seriously. That's not nice. No, it's not. But why aren't you sad anymore? I thought about how to explain something so complicated to someone so young, because I learned that some people can't love the way I needed, and that's okay. Is it okay? My teacher says everybody has love inside them. I think everybody has love inside them. I agreed, but sometimes people's love gets all tangled up with fear and pain and anger, and when that happens, their love comes out wrong. It hurts instead of helping. Like a hug that's too tight. Exactly like that, a hug that's too tight. So what do? Emma asked, swinging her legs. You stop trying to get the right kind of hug from people who can only squeeze too tight. You find people who know how to hug properly. Or you learn to be okay without that hug. Can you be okay without hugs? I think you can. I think you can be okay with different kinds of love than you thought you needed. Emma nodded, like this made perfect sense to her. I'm glad you're not sad anymore. Me too. Sarah appeared then, walking down the aisle looking for her daughter. Emma, there you are. I'm sorry, she said to me. She slipped away while I was talking to Father Michael. It's okay. We were having a good conversation. Emma slid off the pew and ran to her mother, then turned back to me. Bye, Angela. I hope you stay not sad. I will. I promised. I watched them leave, and then I sat alone again in the quiet church. Sun was streaming through the stained glass, now painting the stone floor in patches of blue and red and gold. Dust motes drifted through the coloured light. A hug that's too tight. That's what my family's love had been. Suffocating, conditional, painful. And I'd spent 34 years trying to earn the right kind of love from people who didn't know how to give it, who'd never been given it themselves, who were so tangled up in their own pain that love came out as control and cruelty. But I'd stopped trying. I'd found different kinds of love in my work in the community I'd built in the women who walked through the foundation doors and trusted me with their stories. I'd learned to be okay without the love I'd thought I needed. That was what forgiveness really meant. Not telling them they were right or that what they did was acceptable. Just recognizing that I'd been waiting for them to give me something they didn't have, and choosing to stop waiting. Peace wasn't their apology. It wasn't their understanding or their regret. It wasn't even their love. Peace was the moment I decided I didn't need those things anymore. Peace isn't something they give you. It's something you take back. Taking back peace required one last act of release. I'd been carrying physical remnants of my past, like anchors, the torn wedding dress I'd never worn, the cedar box with the lock of a childhood hair my mother had kept. They were stored in my grandmother's house, tucked away, but still present, still tying me to a version of myself I no longer was. It was time to let them go, completely. I pulled the wedding dress from the back of my closet on a Saturday morning. It was still in the garment bag, though torn where my parents had yanked it off the hanger that morning 5 years ago. I'd never opened it since. The silk had yellowed slightly and there was a small stain on the bodice, probably from where I'd clutched it against me while crying in the car after escaping. It had cost $3,000. It represented 6 months of careful planning, excited alterations, dreams of a future that never came. I folded it carefully and placed it in a canvas bag along with the cedar box. Then I drove to Mount Auburn Cemetery, where my grandmother had been buried 6 years ago. It was early autumn, the air-crisp leaves just beginning to turn. I parked and walked through the cemetery gates, following familiar paths to the section where her grave lay beneath an old oak tree. The headstone was simple: Margaret Chen, Stuart beloved mother and grandmother, followed by her dates. I knelt on the grass beside her grave and unpacked the items I'd brought. The wedding dress still in its fold, the cedar box with the lock of hair inside, and a small gardening trowel I'd taken from her garden shed. I started digging. The ground was softer than I expected, rich, dark earth that gave way easily. I dug until I had a hole about 2 feet deep just to the left of her headstone where the grass was thin. Then I placed the wedding dress in first, letting it unfold slightly, in the earth like a white flag of surrender. On top of it, I set the cedar box unopened. I didn't need to look at that lock of hair again. It represented a version of my mother's love that had existed once briefly before. Fear twisted it into something else. I filled the hole back in, patting the earth smooth, replacing the grass as best I could. When I finished, you could barely tell the ground had been disturbed. In a few weeks, the grass would grow back completely, and there would be no visible trace of what I'd buried. I sat back on my heels and looked at my grandmother's name carved in stone. "Grandma," I said softly, "I got your house back. I got myself back. Thank you for leaving me something to fight for. Thank you for loving me when nobody else did." I didn't cry. I'd cried enough over the years. This wasn't a moment for grief. It was a moment for completion. I brushed the dirt from my knees and picked up the trowel and empty bag. As I walked back toward the cemetery gates, I noticed a young woman sitting on the ground beside a grave about 30 feet away. She was maybe 25, wearing jeans and a hoodie, and she was crying, the kind of crying where you're trying to be quiet, but your whole body shakes with it. I almost walked past. Grief is private, and she was entitled to hers. But something made me stop. Maybe it was the way she was sitting, hunched over, making herself small, like she was apologizing for taking up space, even here among the dead. I approached slowly, giving her the time to notice me and wave me off, if she wanted to be alone. When she looked up, her eyes were red and swollen. "I'm sorry to intrude," I said. "I just wanted to make sure you're okay." "I'm fine," she said automatically, then laughed bitterly. "No, I'm not fine. I'm sitting in a cemetery crying at my mother's grave, but I don't know where else to go." "Were you close?" "No, that's the problem." She wiped her eyes with her sleeve. "She died 6 months ago, and I'm here because I keep thinking I should feel sadder than I do, but mostly I just feel relieved, and guilty about feeling relieved." I knew that feeling. I knew it intimately. "Did she hurt you?" I asked gently. The woman looked up at me sharply, surprised. "How did you—" I recognized the look, the confusion about how to mourn someone who hurt you. She was quiet for a moment. "She used to hurt me, physically, emotionally. She said it was discipline, that she was preparing me for the world, but really, she was just—" She trailed off. "I don't know why I'm telling you this. I don't even know you." I pulled a card from my wallet, the Bald Bride Foundation, my name and contact information printed in simple font. I held it out to her. "If you need help, we're here. Counselling, referrals, support groups, people who understand what it's like to grieve complicated relationships." She took the card, read it, looked back up at me. "Your mother, mine too. No. But we're still here. And that means we won." Her eyes filled with fresh tears, but she was smiling slightly. "We won. We survived them. We're living lives they tried to prevent us from having. We're sitting in cemeteries, crying complicated tears, instead of being silent and small like they wanted. That's winning." She held the card carefully like it was fragile. "Thank you. You're welcome. And hey, it's okay to feel relieved. It's okay to not know how to feel. There's no right way to survive someone who is supposed to love you." I left her there with the card and walked back to my car. As I drove out of the cemetery, I thought about all the women I'd met over the past few years who carried versions of the same wound, different details, different families, different forms of cruelty, but the same fundamental story: someone who should have protected them chose to hurt them instead. And we'd all survived. We'd all found ways to keep growing despite the attempts to cut us down. The women who tried to bury me didn't know I was a seed. 2 years after I buried my wedding dress beside my grandmother's grave, the New York Times published an article about me. I found out when my phone started buzzing at 6 a.m. with texts and emails from people I hadn't spoken to in years. The headline read, "From Shame to Strength, How Angela Stewart Turned Her Darkest Day into a Movement." The reporter had spent 3 months interviewing me, visiting the foundation, talking to the women we'd helped. She'd done her research thoroughly, every fact checked, every quote verified, every part of my story told with care and respect. The article opened with the video. 7 years old now, but still powerful, still shocking. Then it traced everything that came after the lawsuits, the public reckoning, the foundation launch, the growth. By the time the article was published, the Bald Bride Foundation had helped over 500 women escape or heal from family abuse. We'd raised nearly $2 million. We had partnerships with hospitals, law firms, and shelters across 6 states. We'd gone from my small office in Somerville to a real headquarters with a staff of 12. The article ended with a quote from me. "They shaved my head to break me, but all they did was show me what I was capable of surviving. And once you know that about yourself, you become unstoppable." 3 weeks after the article ran, I got an email with a subject line I had to read twice to believe TED Talk invitation. Now I stood backstage at the TED conference in Vancouver, waiting for my cue, listening to the speaker before me finish her talk about climate resilience. My heart was pounding, but it was excitement, not fear. I told my story hundreds of times by now, to journalists, to donors, to rooms full of survivors. But this was different. This was a stage where ideas spread to millions. This was my chance to take what happened in that bedroom 7 years ago and turn it into something that could change how people thought about family, about abuse, about survival. My hair had grown back completely. It fell just past my shoulders now, dark and natural, no longer the symbol of my destruction, but just hair. Just part of me. I wore a simple dress, pearl earrings, low heels. I looked like someone who belonged on this stage. "Please welcome Angela Stewart," the host announced, and I walked out into the lights. The audience was a sea of faces in the darkness beyond the stage. I found my mark, took a breath, and began. 7 years ago, on what was supposed to be my wedding day, my family held me down and shaved my head. They did it because they believed I was cursed, because a fortune teller told them my happiness would destroy them, because they'd spent decades resenting me for being born the wrong gender at the wrong time to the wrong expectations. I paused. They filmed it. They laughed. And when I screamed, they told the police I was mentally ill and had done it to myself. The room was absolutely silent. For a long time, I thought that morning defined me. I thought I was the bald bride, the broken daughter, the woman whose family destroyed her. I spent 2 years planning revenge, executing it, watching them lose everything I'd lost. And you know what? The revenge worked. They faced consequences. They lost their home, their jobs, their reputation. I won in court. I got everything I wanted. I walked across the stage, making eye contact with people in the front rows. But winning didn't heal me. Getting justice didn't erase the trauma. I was still empty, still searching for something I couldn't name. Until I realized that healing doesn't come from making the people who hurt you suffer. It comes from transforming your pain into purpose. I told them about the foundation, about Dorothy, the 60-year-old woman who'd stayed silent for 40 years, about Emma asking me about hugs that are too tight, about the young woman crying at her mother's grave, about the hundreds of women who'd walked through our doors carrying shame that didn't belong to them. We live in a culture that tells us family is everything, that blood is thicker than water, that we owe our parents loyalty no matter what. But what about when family is the source of harm? What about when the people who were supposed to protect you are the ones who hurt you most? We don't talk about that. We hide it. We make excuses. We protect the abusers in the name of keeping families together. My voice was strong. clear, carrying to the back of the auditorium. I'm here to say it's okay to walk away. It's okay to choose yourself over family loyalty. It's okay to grieve the parents you deserved instead of the ones you got. And it's okay to transform your trauma into something that helps others, because that's how we break the cycles. That's how we stop the inheritance of pain. I moved back to center stage for my closing. They thought taking my hair would take my power. They were wrong, because power isn't in how you look. It's in how you rise. It's in what you build from the ashes. It's in your refusal to let anyone else's cruelty define your worth. 7 years ago, they tried to destroy me on my wedding morning. What they actually did was free me from needing their love, their approval, or their version of who I should be. They freed me to become who I was always meant to be, not their daughter, not their victim, but myself. The applause started before I finished building as I walked off stage. But the moment that mattered came 20 minutes later during the break, when a young woman with tears streaming down her face ran up to me in the speaker lounge. She threw her arms around me and whispered, "Thank you. You saved me. I've been trying to leave my family for 3 years and I couldn't do it. But hearing you, I can do it now. Thank you for saving me." I held her for a moment, then gently pulled back so I could look at her face. "No," I said, smiling. "You saved yourself. You're the one who's been trying for 3 years. You're the one who's going to walk out that door and build a new life. I didn't save you. I just held the door open." She hugged me again, and over her shoulder I saw other women approaching, waiting their turn to talk, to share their stories, to say they understood. This was what I'd been looking for in that empty space after revenge. Not victory over my family, not even justice. Just this connection, purpose, the knowledge that my pain had become a bridge for others to cross toward their own healing. They shaved my head to destroy me. Instead, they freed me to become who I was always meant to be. If Angela's story moved you, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and your own well-being? Have you walked away from toxic relationships, or are you still finding the courage to do so? Your story matters, and sharing it might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. This channel exists to tell stories like Angela's stories about survival, transformation, and the incredible strength it takes to rebuild yourself after betrayal. If you want more real stories about people who turned their darkest moments into their greatest victories, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week, I bring you true accounts of ordinary people who refused to stay broken, who chose themselves when no one else would, and who built extraordinary lives from the ruins of their past. What did you think about Angela's decision to forgive her parents? Do you think she was too generous, or did she make the right choice? And what about her revenge? Was it justified, or did it go too far? I'm genuinely curious about your perspective, because these are complex questions without easy answers. Let me know in the comments what you would have done in her situation. If Angela's journey inspired you, give this video a thumbs up so more people can find it. Share it with someone who needs to hear that survival is possible, that healing is real, and that nobody has to stay trapped in someone else's story of who they should be. Remember what Angela learned: they can take everything from you, but they can't take your ability to rise. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.